Catherine is gonna send out an attendance sheet, and then also it's like a presentation evaluation from Clarice on Thursday.
Yeah.
Sorry that I was not able to make it, but I hope Brenda helped you guys out as much as she can. She's awesome. I was the star of the Vagina Monologues along with Zara.
It was good times.
It was a good time. It was awesome. I love that show. So definitely got me wanting to do theater more, which is super cool because I'm not a theater person.
Was there a good turnout?
Yeah, we sold out the day of, and then we added some more at the end, so it was over 200 people.
Wow.
I haven't got the exact numbers on, because all the proceeds went to Tahoe Safe Flight, so I haven't got the exact number on how much we raised. There was like vagina lollipops, there were vagina cards, like so cool.
Literally everything.
Yeah. It was cool. It was really cool. So it was a good turnout, and I feel like we should do it every year. I think for a while we were shying away from it because it was kind of such a big production, but it actually turned out, it was a lot of fun too. So.
I went online and they said they were closed out. We were
Yeah.
going away to babysit anyhow. So.
Yeah. Yeah, I had to answer so many phone calls the first day going like, or the last day going, I'm sorry, we're sold out. But it was cool.
And then it looks like Clarice has these anonymous, so don't put your names on it unless you really want her to know who you are. So.
All right, and then today I have Nick Ott from Transgender Alliance Group in Reno. He's here to go over their presentation called Transgender Basics for Everyone, and ask him questions. He will answer them for you. And he's gonna do around 7:30. Shorter after doesn't matter, and then we're gonna talk about cultural competence after. So, and people will come in as they come in. Cool.
Okay.
Take it away, Nick.
Awesome. So I have a couple of things to hand out. One is just my card, although I just realized that the phone number is wrong, so use the email, not the phone number. And then this is our newest resource guide. I think I have plenty, so you guys can take, a couple, so that if you have somebody else who might want one, you can share. And we get them printed regularly, so if you guys ever run out or need more, Andrea can always get you more. She'll love me. Uh-oh. I waited too long.
Oh, it's the computer that turned off right when the presentation
Come on.
goes, right?
Nope. All right, so any questions?
Yes. We're good.
It was really long.
What does the LGBTQ, what's the Q?
The Q is queer questioning. So it can be for either one.
It's not way back in there. It doesn't have the page.
All right. So we do a lot of, I guess I should introduce myself first. So I'm Nick, and I am one of the founding members of TAG, which is Transgender Allies Group, like Andrea said. And we've been around since, July of 2012 was when we first started. And what we found was that there's just a lot of people who need information and who don't have anywhere to go for that in our community. And our community was growing. There's actually quite a large and involved and active trans community in the Reno, Sparks, Carson, Truckee, sort of outlying areas. And we've tried recently to sort of provide some support also to some of the outlying sort of rural areas because there are trans kids and people that live out there too, and they really have no resources. So that's kind of what we do. Our mission is to provide education and sort of spread awareness of what transgender people are, and that we're big and scary. And since I'm in the room with you, you're all gonna catch it. So if she didn't tell you the disclaimer, then you guys are. I'm telling you now. So you're all gonna leave and be trans. You're welcome. So a lot of it is about just busting myths and answering a lot of questions, right? Because it's always awkward to ask someone who you're probably making an assumption about already, right? Like, I think this is a trans person, and now I'm going to ask you some questions, and I don't know if I'm asking you appropriate questions. I don't know if you're going to be offended, or if if you're going to take that in a bad way, right? So that's why we do this. So you can ask me any questions you have, very open. I'll tell you my personal experiences. I'm a trans man, so I was born female. I've obviously transitioned to male, So I'll answer personal questions. I also have a transgender daughter. She's almost 13, lucky me. And she's been presenting and adamantly, persistently being female since she was about 3. So she started dressing as a girl right after kindergarten when we tortured her and made her go to school as a boy. It was horrible. So then she transitioned and she's been dressed and presented as a girl ever since. So she actually inspired me to be myself, because before that I was like, yeah, maybe that T thing might fit me, but I don't know how I feel about doing anything about that. So if you have questions about that, I can go over that too. But this is just sort of more general information, and then we can talk more about domestic violence because it is a higher rate, as I'm sure you would expect. And then if you have other questions, we can take them at the end, or you can ask as we go. It doesn't matter to me either way. Okay? All right. So, what does transgender mean to you? This is interactive, by the way. Don't make me call on you, because I will. What do you guys think? What do you know? Go ahead.
I don't remember what the distinction is between sex versus gender, but it's being born with, I guess it's the gender assigned to you as female. Your brain realizes that you're actually male. Doesn't it's in combatance with what your assigned genitals are. It's uncomfortable, and it's not who your true identity is.
Nice, very good. Any other ideas or additional input?
Yeah, I just thought of identifying with the opposite gender in your pronouns.
Okay, good. Anybody else? Anything different than those two? Okay. So it's kind of a, first of all, which you guys already seem to know, is when we first started hearing the word transgender, a lot of people got really confused, right? Because it got stuck on the LGB, and then we have a T. So LGB are all about sexual orientation. And then you get this T thing, right? And so people really got confused, and they thought it was about sexual orientation, but it's not the same. And it gets really confusing when you try to explain your sexual orientation and being transgender, because people get confused, right? So are you using what you were born as to decide what your sexual orientation is? Or are you using what your current pronouns are or your preferred pronouns are to decide your sexual orientation? So the way that works is, so I, as a female, when I was born a female, I identified as a lesbian because I was sexually attracted to women. Okay, so when I transitioned, it's really interesting because now I'm in the world of being a heterosexual, which is very different from the experience I had as a lesbian. So, and not also, you know, I got to transition into white male privilege, which is not something everyone gets to do, but I recommend it because it works, it helps you out so much. Got a raise, get treated great. So it was an unexpected byproduct, but it's really entertaining, and talk about a whole world of difference from moving from being a woman in a man's world to being a man in a man's world. It's very interesting the things you realize that most other men, you know, they would never know that. So they are separate and they can be confusing, right? But it is more about how you understand your gender. So sex is your body parts, gender is your internal identity of who you are and how that shows up. One adjustment to kind of what you were saying is that initially I would say the idea of being transgender was very much based on a gender binary scale, right? So you're either male or you're female. And you had to stand in your little box, right? And we all know the stereotypes of what a traditional man looks like this and a traditional female looks like this. What we're learning now is that there's this whole spectrum, right? And people don't want to be in little boxes. They want to be able to express themselves and be who they are without having to check off these stereotypical boxes of, well, guys have short hair and they dress this way, and women have to have long hair and they have to dress this way. Right? We've broken down so many of those gender norms in the last 50 years, right? Women are supposed to go to work now, right? And they're supposed to also still balance being a mom and taking care of all the kids, mostly by themselves. But guys are starting to come into that area too, right? And it's starting to be okay for the guy to stay home and take care of the kids if the woman has the job that makes more money than the guy, right? That used 30 years ago, that was a big no-no, right? If your woman made more money than you as a man, there was something wrong with you. You were a failure. So there's a lot of change happening just along the way we treat gender roles in the first place. And so this is part of that change, right? And freeing people from being like, well, I can't be a man and be an artist because then everybody's gonna think I'm gay, right? I can't do those things because that's a woman's thing. Or I can't be a male nurse, right? Or like all of these things that are traditionally expected roles. Oh, you're a nurse and you're a man. You must be a gay man. No, I just like taking care of people, right? So there's all these things that we've really pushed people into these little pigeonholes, right? And everybody's like, I don't want to be in your little pigeonhole. I want to be myself, and I want to be free to be myself and not have to deal with people treating me funny because of gender roles, right? Which are completely made up and ridiculous anyhow. So, that was a lot for one thing. Okay. So gender specifically refers to the roles like we've been talking about, behaviors, activities, and characteristics that society considers appropriate for men and women. So key part being society, right? We're sort of ingrained with this from birth, right? Before we're even born, and before we have children of our own, we're trying to decide what color to paint the nursery. Right?
Yeah.
Because somehow whatever genitalia you have decides what color you like, right? And I don't know, did you guys know where the color assignment came from? Boy and blue and
I
girl?
know it's like reversed though, actually, at some point in history.
Yeah.
I know that, so.
So the whole reason we have colors for genders is because a department store that made children's clothing, babies' clothing, wanted to sell more baby clothes. So initially, all babies' clothes were white because they were easier to clean. You just bleached them, right? And they were all dresses because then you could access the diaper. So if you look at old photographs of presidents, they're all wearing white dresses. There's a reason. That's what everybody used. Then the department store was like, these people are having more babies, but nobody's buying more clothes because they can just use the clothes they have from whatever gender baby they had before, right? It didn't matter. So they got some marketing genius decided, well, let's open a new line of baby clothes, and we're going to separate the sexes, right? And they had pink for boys and blue for girls because blue was a softer color and pink was a strong, manly color. Well, that department store went out of business. So the one that stayed in business switched it and decided that blue was a more suitable color for boys and pink was a more suitable color for girls. And that's how we got gender colors. So all of the things we know about colors and babies is from a marketing ploy to sell more baby
It's
clothes.
about money.
Mhm.
Drives everything.
Right. So and it's so funny because people will argue with you about, why is your girl wearing blue? You're confusing everyone. It's such a bad thing that you're doing. It's like, really? It's just a color, right? But so I always found that interesting that that's where that came from. It wasn't like, in the Bible or, it wasn't like in some major, thing that you have to follow. It wasn't a law. It didn't come from anywhere useful. It really just came from people wanting to make more money.
Well, what's so interesting is if people actually knew the root of where that come from, like they would probably be like, well, that was just a scheme to make money off of people. If that was presented as that the whole time, we probably, we wouldn't have the issues we have today.
Well, and that's
in
what
a certain
happens.
sense.
Things get perpetuated, and you
Yeah.
forget the origination of why that happened, and it just becomes the new norm. And then people just continue to do that because that's what everybody's always done,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, I could be wrong, but I thought like back in like certain like European royal families, they did use reds and blues, but vice versa, boys were reds, girls were blues. And it's because of where they are on the color spectrum. They're like
Opposites.
almost exact opposites.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it was like a place in the hierarchy for princes and princesses. So
I haven't heard that one, but that would make sense too.
Yeah.
It's interesting to me that color can have, color doesn't actually have a gender, right? Just like your clothing
right.
doesn't actually have a gender. Like, again, marketing for selling clothes, right? You have the men's department and the women's department. Clothing is really, it's
Clothing.
I know the women's department has all the good clothes.
well, see, and I feel the opposite because I try to dress, I have a teenage daughter. Trying to dress a teenage daughter, I'm like, let's go to the men's clothes. First of all, there's actual fabric there, Second of all, you're not going to freeze to death because it'll actually cover you and be thick enough to keep you warm, which is the entire point of clothing.
All up layers, man.
So crazy.
Tube tops with that.
So bad. It doesn't help that I was forced to wear girls' clothes for so long that I hate them anyway, right? That doesn't help. My poor daughter.
So, when did you make the transition?
I transitioned when I was, 38 now, and I transitioned when I was 32.
Wow.
Yeah, which is a whole different experience
Yeah.
from that of my kid who transitioned at 6.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Different era too.
Yes.
The vibration.
I mean, I didn't even know what transgender was when I was in high school. It wasn't, and I'm not that old, so it's not like it was something that was being talked about. We didn't even really.
But we're like in that shifting point, you know, we're like literally on the razor's edge.
Yeah.
You know?
And it's amazing to me, like my kids are, I have 2 kids that are in high school, and then I have 2 younger kids. And the 2 that are in high school are, you know, half their friends are somewhere in the LGBT 3,000 letters later spectrum. Like everybody's something. And there's all these new letters that keep getting added. And I can't keep up, to be honest. And not to be, I'm not trying to be rude or unidentify or, you know, whatever, but pretty soon I think all of those labels are just gonna spell out human.
Yeah.
You know, like it doesn't really, do you really have to identify every
No,
single
you
person
don't.
as something?
Right.
And I think that the more, what's going to happen eventually is that the letters will matter anymore, right? And that's the whole point. The whole point is that why do we feel the need to label? Why do we feel the need to put people in boxes? None of us fit nicely into any one box anyway, right? Whether it's a gender box or any other part of your life, right? We have, especially, I mean, you've got race and gender, and you've got ethnicity, and you've got culture, and you've got languages, and there's so many things. Gender's just one of the newer ones. And it isn't even that new, it's just new to us. Okay, so we already kind of went over this.
It's kind of interesting, like you were saying, gay and lesbian is about sex. And to me, that always was a little uncomfortable. I like that a person would
The whole
identify as
around
their
sexual
sexual-
preference.
Yes.
Like if I walked around saying, well, I'm heterosexual,
Right.
like all day, right? I used to have to say, I think that's normal. That's why I think gender is a good step forward instead of
But-
just focusing on the sexual orientation.
But trans, it sounds to me like transcending gender at the same time.
Yeah.
So it's like, it's progressive, more progressive than maybe another identity label.
Yeah, well, and it's interesting because you bring up a good point, which is that I have grandparents who are like, oh, I hate those pride parades. Why do they have to wave it around? I don't care what you're doing in your bedroom. I don't care who you want to have sex with. I don't walk around talking about who I like to have sex with. You know, and they get all upset, right? Because sex was not something that you talked about. Anyway, you weren't walking around like, hey, I like to have sex with these people, right?
Yeah.
Here's a picture of who I, right? That wasn't something that was done. And so the fact that now, or not now, but that started happening really upset a lot of people because they didn't want to talk about sex. And I find a lot of pushback happens with gender because nobody ever thought you could nobody thought to question it, right? And if you don't question it, great for you, right? But that's not everybody's experience. And what's really hard is when it's not your experience to understand that it is someone else's experience. And that they're not just, mentally insane or something, right? It's hard when you don't feel what other people go through. And a lot of people in our world, especially, the people who are straight, who are white, who are male, right, are mostly the people who have the majority in our country. And they don't have any of those experiences. They have the same difficulty understanding what it's like to be a young black man. Right? They have the same difficulty understanding what it means to be a young, Hispanic person who's been brought here through no fault of their own or choice of their own, right? They have no idea what any of those experiences are like. All they know is what the life that they live, which any of the rest of us know, is not what the rest of us live, right? And so understanding, it goes into this whole thing of white privilege and male privilege and
Male, yeah.
it's very interesting. Being transgender, you get this really incredible opportunity to see what it's like to be two completely separate genders and to see how people treat you differently is really interesting to me. So I find that we have some really interesting input. I keep thinking I should be like a relationship therapist because I know how men think and I know how women think. And I'm like, I see the gap. Like I can clearly define where the gap happens. It's really entertaining.
You need to, it's good, share that.
I know,
Have a
right?
course, right?
That's
That's
like a $1 million course right there.
Yeah.
I don't know. Maybe I'll write a book.
Yeah.
You've touched on why
You should.
we're going through what we're going through right now. There is so much fear of isolation, not from LBGT, transgender, African American, from the white male. There's so much fear of isolation, separation, and loneliness.
Mhm.
And the more it's being presented to them, that there's actually this unconditional expression that's out there, which at the end of the day, we're just all human beings. That's all we are. And it's very difficult. That's why what we're going through right now is it's necessary, but it's so severe as well, because it's right behind that fear is a lot of anger and violence.
Yeah, well, and I think we're breaking right now out of the conditioning. Like my childhood was G.I. Joe, WWF, like all men do this, boys do this. Like my dad was kind of sensitive, but really kind of like my generation, like me, by the time I have 3 children, 19-year-old son, like I cried to him, dude. I talked to him about everything. I never hid my emotions, you know. I told him about all my hardships, you know. I was like, we had like a very open, and then my daughter as well, like all my kids. So it was like, and I feel like in my generation, at least in my own experience, like that's breaking down the male pride. Like my stepson wanted to be the pink Power Ranger when they dressed up as Power Rangers all the time. You know what I'm saying? I had no qualms with it, and he's straight as they come. You know, he's 26 years old now, but he came like that already. You know, like without the judgment, and it was never like, why do you want to be the pink Ranger? It was like, okay, cool, dope, dude, you're dope. Yeah, and it was like, so I feel like in my experience, we're shifting. Right now.
I think that in some ways it's scary for the people who have never felt uncomfortable by the sort of status quo conditioning that the rest of us have gotten, right? Because it met their world. It was in line with who they were and what they wanted. It made sense to them. And so they have fear because everybody else is saying, hey, you know, that doesn't fit for me. And because it's the norm, right? They have a vested interest in trying to keep it there. Because that's what works best for them. So it's definitely, it's sticky. It's a sticky situation, and it is evolving, and people are changing, and people are being more willing to say what's true for them, right? And that's scary for anyone when it's not the mainstream. But then the mainstream people are like, hey, but if we just take away everything, where do I fit? Right? If I had this spot and I feel like people are taking it away or telling me it's wrong or it's bad, then where do I still fit? So I think that there's an identity crisis that's happening, you know, even among sort of the mainstream people. And what's really interesting to me, which kind of goes along with what you're saying, is that when I started transitioning, I had a lot of, I don't know if I'd say a lot, but I had a few good male friends that I could ask questions to, because there's a lot of things when you don't grow up in a certain gender role that you just don't know. And they're sort of like below the surface. You don't really think about them until they happen. I'll give you an example. When I started using male restrooms, it's terrifying, first of all. And they're pretty, some of them are really nasty, but I've been in some really disgusting women's bathrooms too, so I don't know why it has to be so disgusting. I don't know why we can't just be clean, but whatever. But what was terrifying to me was I didn't know what to do, because the men's room, you've got urinals and then you have stalls. And there's usually, a lot of times you'll have like 18 urinals and 2 stalls. So I have to use a stall. I don't have the equipment to not use a stall. So I'm like, okay, I have to wait for a stall. I don't know what I do while I'm waiting, right? Like there's a line of people. I don't want to stare at the guys at the urinal, but I also need to be paying attention to like when somebody comes out, right? So I'm like, and then like, what if there's only one stall? Then Do I wait outside? I don't know what the etiquette is, right?
Talk to the guy in the stall.
Right, exactly. You're like, hey man, how's it going? You almost done in there? What's going on? So it's so awkward when you don't, and I didn't realize I didn't know what to do until I was there, waiting. And then I felt so awkward and had so much anxiety, right? Women will stand in line forever. They'll talk to each other, they'll hand each other toilet paper under, there's no weirdness, right? Or there wasn't for me because I was used to that. But I was so confused. And then I'm like, I have to ask my guy friends, like, I don't know what to do. I know you're supposed to like go as far away, like if there's 4 urinals, somebody's at that one, you have to go all as far away from the other guy as you can get, which is fine, right? That makes sense to me. But I was like, I don't know what to do, I don't know where I'm going, I don't know how long I'm supposed to wait, or what do I say when somebody else comes in and they're like, are you gonna use the, I don't know how to navigate that situation, right? Not something you think about until you're in the situation. And then I realized how many times stuff like that happens with the trans women I know, where they don't know what to do in situations either. It's really interesting, actually. We have a lot of conversations about that kind of stuff because you don't know what you don't know until you need to know it. And then you're like,
Shit.
now what? And one of the things that's funny is, so like when you grow up as a girl, you're trained and taught to be like afraid of guys, right? Like if it's dark outside and you're walking to your car, first of all, you're making sure you're parking under the light. You're making sure that you have somebody with you. You've got your exit strategy. Your keys are in your hand. You've got them poking out. You are ready and terrified, right? And you're like, I'm walking like this, like, come on, bring it, right? You gotta make yourself not into a target, right? Not into a victim. And you get taught that from a very young age. So these trans women I know, they walk around like they're guys, right? Guys are not taught that. You're not taught to be afraid at night that you're out walking to your car. And so these things that you have to share with the people who are going the opposite direction, right? Of things that they didn't get, that they didn't learn. And it's funny because I'm constantly fighting with my,
Oh, Catherine.
I'm constantly fighting with my little girl because she likes to sit like this. And I'm like, no, you're a girl. Close your legs. You have to close your legs all of the time. That's like these little things that you don't get taught, right? Unless you grow up that way.
It's kind of funny if you look at all the girls in the room with their legs crossed.
Except me, I'm so adult.
And her sister
You're
Lauren
yucky.
too. Her sister Lauren manspreads more than me. Like, she sits back.
I have never
Yeah, that, like on the bus where a man sits down and takes up like 3 seats. And you're like,
nothing to
sit down. Yeah.
But like over life, you develop her. Like I'm very comfortable in the position I'm in right now. Like I just, oh yeah.
Right, but because nobody taught you as you grew up, like,
No.
hey, if you do this, that means you're a whore.
Yeah.
No one said like, hey, if you sit like this, you're like, come and get it. That is what you get taught as a little girl. Like, hey, you don't sit like that.
Yeah.
It's
But
somehow
that's-
it's like an invitation, right? Guys are like, invitation! And the wider you have the man spread, obviously the bigger your stuff is, right? So that's a good sign. That's like peacock feathers.
We should break that stereotype though, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
It's things that you learn.
Yeah.
And what the biggest issue, well maybe not the biggest issue, that's probably going a little too far, but when you're transitioning, you're terrified that you're not gonna pass. And I'm lucky because testosterone is really strong as a hormone. And it creates all these secondary characteristics, right? Like, nobody's gonna mistake me for being a girl, right? Once I started growing facial hair, even though I still had breasts, and then I had a chest reduction surgery, but even when I saw breasts, most of the time, I would still get clocked as a guy. Sometimes I get some like, I was just like, I'm chubby, it's fine. Strap it down, it'll be fine. But that's not the case with people who become, full-grown adult male bodies, do not transition well. Facial hair does not go away. You have to like zap every single individual tiny little hair, like 1,000,000 times. It's expensive and it's painful. You can't get rid of an Adam's apple, right? I don't have one, but when you have one, it sticks out and it's hard to hide. So it's especially important that little things, that even though we're trying to bust the stereotype, but it's something that can make people who are already like Is
Right.
that a boy or a girl? Go, oh, that's a guy. That guy doesn't know how to sit like a girl. It's clearly a guy. So all of these little like cues that you're giving off that you don't even know you're giving off. Which is funny because now I typically come across as a gay guy. I'm like, that's because I like air supply. It's fine. Okay, so some of the other, you had asked about the Q, which is questioning or queer. It's also kind of become this like gender non-conformance, gender fluid. There's like a million different names now, right, that people are using. And a non-label. I don't know how you can have a label and say this is my non-label is this. That seems odd to me, but people do it.
Do you ever think it gets to the point where it's like too much?
Oh, I already think that. I already think that. It's really, and this isn't even all of them.
What's
Oh, I know.
pansexual and demisexual?
Okay, so let's go through them. Intersex is actually the physical condition. So I always get this number wrong. I believe there are 46 separate chromosomes that create your sexual characteristics of your body.
Yeah.
So think about if you had a 46 character password and you have to hack this password. How many different options do you have? Right? There's like a million different variations. More than a million, I'm sure. I don't do the math, but I'm sure it's a lot. That's the same that you're gonna get, right? So the idea that you are either born with a penis or you're born with a vagina, and those are the only two options, is not reality. There are 46 different ways that those parts get put together. And that's gonna happen, the more people we have in the world, the more different variations we have. So intersex is when your body physically doesn't fall into a typical or normal, right, male or female genitalia. And a lot of times these kids don't know. What used to happen a lot, not as much today, but used to happen a lot, is the doctor would say, well, it's kind of ambiguous. And they'd ask the parent, do you want a boy or a girl? And then they would make that child's genitalia match.
Like
And-
surgery?
Yes, and usually they would make it a girl because it was easier to create a vagina than it is to create a penis.
Wow.
Yeah. So then whatever happens internally for that kid, right, is going to be a nightmare if it doesn't match up. And the worst part is most of those parents would never tell their kid. And so then their kid would start going through puberty and they'd be all over the place and they'd feel really weird and they'd have all these problems. And because they would only do surgery externally, they could have internal problems. So like if they actually had testicles that had never dropped, right, they could have those and they would start having these problems because they didn't have anywhere to go, so they'd have to stay up and they'd start having all these medical issues and they'd go to the hospital with all these problems. And then the doctor would be like, you have testicles, like you're a boy, right? Which again would jump to the other side. And the kid's like, what is happening? And the parents are like, selectively forgot about that, right? Like, oh, yeah, about that. Because they were never going to tell them in the first place, right? Thinking, I'm not saying that these parents did this maliciously, right? They were doing what they thought was best for their kid and based on what the doctor told them. There's a lot of stuff happening in the medical community with basically saying like, don't perform surgery on these children. It's whatever is going on, unless they have like open things that are not like, completely finished, let's say, right? Unless they have some body part that's not safe, let them grow up with whatever ambiguity they have and figure it out, and then they can make that choice themselves, right? Rather than making it for a baby without having any idea how that's going to affect them later, right?
Like they should do with religion. My personal opinion.
Okay, next. So A is for asexual or androgynous. So asexual just means people who don't have much of a sex drive, or they're not interested in having sex with anyone. Pansexual kind of started coming up. It's interesting. To me, it sort of showed up as when people started coming out as being transgender. People felt that they needed a different sort of sexual box to check because, oh, well, I like this guy, but he has girl parts.
Right.
So what does that make me?
Yeah.
So pansexual means that they don't care about your parts. They fall in love with the person. Okay? Demisexual is a new one recently as well, that I had to have somebody else explain to me because I was confused. I was like, does that mean partly? That's what demi means, right? Like demigod is like half God, so is it like you're half sexual? I don't understand how that works. They're like, no, it's when you don't have sex unless you're emotionally like you're emotionally invested.
Okay.
And I'm like, but that could be any of,
Yeah.
okay. Right, so then I was just confused.
Androgynous is hermaphrodite, right? So is that synonymous with asexual, or is asexual different than androgynous?
So they're not synonymous, and androgynous can just be that they don't want to be seen as either or. It doesn't have to be the same as like a hermaphrodite. Hermaphrodite is typically been what a specific part of the intersex community, and it is usually considered a offensive term, just as an FYI. Like I said, you can't offend me. Say whatever you need to say here, because I'd rather you say it to me
Well,
than somebody who gets upset about it.
It comes from
Right.
Aphrodite and Hermes. It's two,
Right.
it's two gods put together there, because in Greek it was the highest form of. They believe we were all androgynous before we separated.
Right.
So that's where it comes from. But
Right.
So just out of curiosity, does someone consider it an insult? Not necessarily an insult, because it could be without meaning insult. Unless, of course, the
It's all
person
about connotation, right? And where not the typical of where an actual word came from, but
Right.
how it was used historically,
got it. Okay.
right? So you can ask the same question about the N-word, right?
Right.
Why do people take that as a derogatory statement? Some people don't. I've actually met African Americans or black people who are like, no, I don't. That word doesn't bother me at all.
Right.
And I'm like, okay, well, I'm still not using it because I enjoy breathing and I feel like it's offensive. So that's fine. But it's really becomes, and there's this whole movement too, right, where people want to take back words that that were used against them and sort of make them their like power word. This computer doesn't like me.
Oh.
Okay.
Oh.
Oh, I moved. That's what happened. Okay. Does that make sense?
Got you.
Okay. Yes.
Is that, so growing up, queer was like considered a derogatory, I don't
Yeah.
know. Okay, yeah,
Yeah,
okay.
yeah.
So now it's like they're taking
Same
it
for me,
back,
I
it's
know.
okay, it's
I
safe, like we're good.
Again, what I would always say is let the person identify themselves.
Okay,
Because then you just use the same terms that they use. Same thing goes for pronouns, the name they use, right? Whatever they say, hey, if they come up to you, and which I've had people do this to me, and it cracks me up every time. They're like, oh, I'm a blah, 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 blah. And I'm like, what's your name? Like, I'm just gonna call you that, right? Like, that's a whole lot easier for me, and that was a whole lot of information, and we are not speed dating. So, I don't know if I needed to know all of that, but okay, right? Like, some people want all of their labels out in front of them, right? They feel very open that way, which is fine. But
Well, that's protection from judgment.
Right.
yes, and I personally, this is my personal view, not Tag's view necessarily, but my personal view is that a lot of violence that happens to transgender people is because we don't tell people that we interact with soon enough that we're transgender. And so they get a conception in their mind, because we all make instant impressions, right? And we assume things about people when we look at them. And so what happens is, after a certain amount of time goes by, and it's different for each person, when you challenge that initial impression, it really messes with their mind. And especially in relationships, right? If you think, if you identify as something specific here, right? Or not here, as more might be the case, right? And you assume something about the person you're meeting, like we all do, and then it gets challenged after you already have feelings involved, then there's that feeling of betrayal and distrust, and that's where the anger and then violence often comes from, if that makes sense.
But at the same time, we all just said that none of us go around telling people who we have sex with.
Right, but we get angry with our own assumptions, right? When you assume something without thinking about it, and then it's wrong or it's different, it bothers you.
Right.
And some people have a very violent response to that, right? It's the same as, you know, when somebody comes out as gay to their parents. Before your kid is born, you have expectations of what their life is going to be like. And as soon as you know what sex the baby is, right, you think, oh, they're going to be a bride, they're going to be a groom, they're going to have this kind of life, they're going to play sports, they're going to, right? Whatever it is that your family typically, or you want for that kid is already made up. and when that gets challenged, right? Whether it's gender, whether it's sexuality, whether it's no, Dad, I don't want to play sports because I'd rather write a book, right? Like any of those things, there becomes friction, right? And often abuse happens in that space, right? Some psychology there. Okay, so what's cisgender? Have you guys heard that term? Yes, no? Some yeses?
No, I have not.
Okay, so cisgender is, there's actually a term for you people who like match, just so you know. We've created a label for you. You're welcome. It's cisgender, cis meaning the same. So your gender and your sex organs match. Okay,
I
it
like
just,
how they needed to come up with a
yes.
label for
Well,
it.
because we have to talk about it and we're not gonna call you normal. Okay, that's unacceptable. We gave you a different name. Okay, so when you're not transgender, for everybody else, right, it's cisgender, which just means same.
What does CIS stand for?
That's I think it's either Latin or Greek, but it's for same.
Same.
So the matching between sex at birth, designated gender.
So you think there's gonna be a
marker.
bunch of people that start getting offended about this and get a movement?
I think it could be, right? I think it'd be like, we didn't choose that. I'm not using that label. Don't label me that. I didn't choose that. So I think all of you should at least once introduce yourself to someone as cisgender and see what happens. Because I guarantee they're gonna be like, what does that mean?
I thought you
I
were
mean,
straight.
like,
Yeah, exactly. Wait,
definitely in the
does that mean you're really the opposite, right? Of whatever they're gonna really blow their mind. You're gonna be like, no, it means I'm the same as you. And they're gonna be like, now you just called me cisgender? What is
I
that
think
about?
we're playing like the sisterhood.
Right. Yeah.
Right. Okay. So transgender is this huge sort of, it's become a more culturally sensitive, shall we say, word to kind of cover a bunch of things. There's a lot of stuff up here that different people would be really unhappy about. I also, drag queen and king is up here. Personally, I don't think of those people as transgender, because to me, transgender means that you're not just, like, to me, drag queens and kings are performance artists, right? They put on
Definitely.
they put on this performance of this, and it's overdone, right? Like
Their
I'm not
personalities
out here
match
trying to
a
be
lot of
like,
times.
yeah, and it's not always great, right? And they're very like, hey, I'm a chick with a dick, right? And you're like, oh, okay, that is definitely not what a transgender woman is going to say to you, right? They're going to not want you to know if that's the case. So this one I always kind of, I don't know. We fought and I lost and whatever it ended up on. So
I feel like all of this is
What is a
kind
gender
of,
outlaw?
you know, all of it is kind of, in some level, superficial, appearance-based.
right, it is.
How you present yourself.
Aren't all labels like
So,
superficial eventually?
well, not labels. I'm talking about these lifestyles in which they, you know, create the outward impression that
Right.
might be incongruent with what they are or not.
That's the problem with labels, right?
Right.
They only cover a part of you, whether it's a visual part of you or an internal part of you, right? Like my wife is super pale and has bright red hair, and she is part Indian, and no one believes her because she does not look Indian at all, right? And or Native American, whatever term you want to use. But so, and it's because, so no one would ever say that's part of her label, right? The myriad of little check boxes of all of the things that make up who you are. Not everybody sees all of those, right? And not everybody wants to display all of their own little check boxes anyway, right?
Of their self-identity
Yeah.
versus their label.
Right.
So your internal view of yourself versus what somebody else is seeing of you.
And we all have had moments where somebody thinks something about us that we would never say about ourselves, right? Whether it's good or bad, right?
True.
So, I mean, you can never know everything about someone. Most of us don't know everything about ourselves. Okay, so let me just break some of these down. F to M, that's female to male. So then this would be the opposite, male to female. Transsexual is sort of an older term. Also, transvestite, which has historically been really not a happy term, right? People don't really call themselves transvestites. I mean, well, I guess if they call themselves that, then go ahead and use that. I have a really hard time with that one. It doesn't seem very respectful to me.
What did vestate, and what does that word mean?
How you dress.
Isn't it vestir, like dress, like in Spanish?
It's how,
Yeah.
it's how
So
you
you dressed opposite, basically. is what
It's
saying.
like cross-dresser.
Okay.
Right. And I don't like transsexual, which is why I think we ended up with transgender, not because of me, but the reason transsexual became an issue is because being trans is not about your sex.
Right, you don't.
Right? And so
yeah,
this
yeah.
made people really focus on the sex part. And we were like, no, like that's not what this is about. So that's how transgender sort of became a term, was it's not about sex, it's about gender. And that really makes a difference for a lot of people who don't support different sexual orientations, right, or have issues with that. Gender is something completely different, and so this helps sort of separate that. Pre, post, and non-op are a whole world of things that you don't really ask people unless they're your best friend. And then they're just telling you because you're talking about their life. So pre would be before they have surgery. Usually these things, so like I've had chest surgery, removal, but that wouldn't be an op. An op is usually bottom surgery or gender confirmation surgery or gender reassignment surgery. There's lots of different words for it. But so pre would be before that, post would be after that. Non would be people who aren't going to do that, which a lot of female to male, a lot of us don't have bottom surgery because it's really hard to make a working penis that pees, almost impossible. It's much easier to take something that's there and make it smaller, right? So a lot of male to females have bottom surgery and have these, what they call a neo-vagina that they can have made, and then they can use that in all the normal ways except obviously childbirth. But so non-op is often somebody who just chooses not to, and there are a lot of other people that just choose not to have surgery anyway, right? Surgery is a big deal.
Wouldn't that just be like a transgender?
Yeah.
At that point, so without,
It's very
it's like
specific.
redundant almost.
Right, it's very specific, and again, like we were talking about, the people who come out and want to give you every label that they have, right, may throw these things out at you. And again, to me, that's way more information than I typically need when I'm meeting someone. But a lot of times people feel the need, let's say you were in a dating situation, they may feel the need to tell you that, right? Because that might matter to you, what genitalia they still have or
Well,
don't
at the
have.
drag show we went to, every single one pretty much told us what
Yeah,
what
we just
they
went to
were.
one. Yeah, we went to one like a couple weeks ago.
Oh yeah?
Yeah, it was awesome. I learned a lot.
What I always think is interesting at those is, I always think if I was up there, would I want to share that much information?
Right.
Right? Or what would happen if you went to one and everyone was required to share that kind of information, right?
Yeah.
Right? Because people are always interested. Like I get all kinds of inappropriate questions that I'm like, I don't really know you that well. So, I mean, in this setting, I'll answer anything because that's what I'm here to do. But if I'm just walking down the street and somebody wants to ask me something really weird, I'm gonna be like, that's none of your business.
Yeah.
That's what that is. That's my answer, right? And so I always think it's interesting because when you go to a show like that, or you're at an event where you know there's gonna be a bunch of trans people, let's say, those are the things that are constantly in our minds, right? And I do it too. Don't think that it's just because you're cisgender that you have these thoughts, right? As a transgender person, I will sit in a room full of other transgender people and I'll be like, I can't tell, did you already transition? Or like, is this your new presentation? Or have you not and those are the things that you get caught up with, right? It's nature. It's totally human nature that you're curious and you're wondering and you're trying to figure it out. And then I catch myself and I'm like, you're not supposed to be doing these things. Like you're supposed to know better, right? But it still happens. It's super funny.
Somewhere between none of your business and TMI.
Right, exactly.
Like-
Exactly. Okay, so a lot of so here's another thing. If you were ever part of the LGBT, let's say, community, you would know that the B had a really hard time becoming a letter. Okay, being bisexual was something for a very long time, and it still happens today. The lesbians and gays were like, no, pick a side. Check a box. You can't just be on the fence. choice. You can't have your cake and eat it too. You need to pick one, right? And it still happens, right? So just because we're all, all the letters under the rainbow, so to speak, does not mean we all get along or respect each other's choices, right? It's still happening. So we're just as bad. And the same thing happens under this transgender umbrella. A lot of people don't, there was just a discussion I heard that went really badly where a bunch of people basically told cross-dressers that they can't use the transgender title because they're not really transgender. They're just wearing clothes from the other side of the aisle. And so those things happen within the communities too, right? Which makes everything harder. If your own community isn't open, right, and not labeling you or forcing you into a box, they're like, no, I'm in my own box, but I chose this box, but I'm gonna put you in a box. Still, I don't understand. It's ridiculous. You'd think we would understand that and move on, but nope. Okay, any other questions?
Yeah, gender outlaw. We don't know.
They're all
I think I'm a
these are all
demisexual.
just like random
I'm
words
a-
that people chose.
If I have to be labeled, I'm a demisexual gender outlaw.
Gender outlaw.
Yeah.
All right, Danny.
Put it on your business cards, Danny.
Someone
Okay.
make sure that they're emotionally attached without having that sexual attraction or
They don't have sex unless they're
This is
emotionally involved.
Yeah, you need the connection.
Which was
Well
really
said.
entertaining when I had a young person tell me that, and I was like, yeah, that used to just be called relationships.
yeah, isn't that a lot of people?
That used to just be like
Yeah.
the norm, right? That was why you had sex unless you were having a one-night stand, and then it
I
was
was gonna say,
expected.
but then when you're not in a relationship, most people have a few flings
Right.
between relationships, right?
It wasn't like a whole sexual orientation though,
Yeah, right.
right? Like that was just like, oh, I just don't do one-night stands. Oh, okay. But now there's a word for it. There's a label to hold on
And it
to.
falls under transgender?
No,
or
it falls under the letters of the
The-
alphabet
okay.
under the rainbow
Got it,
that we
okay.
go over. Yeah.
It's the D for Danny.
There you go. All right, so this is a little less fun. So gender dysphoria. This is a diagnosis that often is desired by trans people because it gets you the ability to get healthcare options covered. Okay, so just like any other thing in healthcare, when you want to actually go to the doctor for something and have it be paid for, you have to have some kind of diagnosis, right? That's how billing works. It used to be called gender identity disorder, and that was really stigmatizing to be like, you have a disorder, because this is still in the DSM, which is the mental health diagnoses, which can be good and can be bad. It just depends on who you're going to and how your insurance decides they want to treat you.
So both are in the DSM now?
No, the gender identity disorder is no longer.
Okay.
But both terms came out, both of them are diagnoses for mental health, not for medical health.
Yeah, and I mean, the DSM-5 only came out in 2013.
Yeah, I was gonna say-
So it's going to be updated in probably another 5 years.
Yeah, I was
We'll
gonna
get there.
say gender identity disorder was in the DSM-4, wasn't
Yeah.
it? Yeah, which was,
And that was
2012.
2012.
And that was
yeah.
the first time that there was even anything in there
Yeah.
that could be used to get services for people who were transgender. And that wasn't, transgender wasn't even necessarily a term quite yet then, or it was just beginning. So gender dysphoria, not all trans people have gender dysphoria. And it's something that can come and go, kind of like a situational depression. Some people have it all the time, because just like anything, it's a continuum of how you identify and how severely you really feel about that difference, okay? So let me try to think about a way to explain that. For me, my experience wasn't deadly. I'll put it that way. I wasn't going to kill myself because I couldn't transition and be a man. I really wanted to be a man. I felt like I was born in the wrong body, but it wasn't so intense for me that I couldn't move on with my life and still, I was already married, I already had children, all of those things before I transitioned. And I probably wouldn't have transitioned if it wasn't for the fact that my kid was trans. Honestly, and I was like, you just go right ahead, you be you. And then I was like, wow, I'm such a hypocrite. I should probably go do the scary thing myself before I send a 6-year-old out, right? It seems fair.
Can I ask a
So
question?
for me, it was really low. But some people are. Hold on, just one second. Some people, it's like life or death. Like every breath is painful for them. And so those are the people who, and it's a spectrum. So everywhere in between. And sometimes it's worse than other times. Go ahead.
Did you birth your children?
No. No, I haven't birthed any
Adopt?
children. My wife has 3 kids from a previous marriage, and their father didn't want to pay child support. Lucky for me. So he actually wrote away his rights so that I could adopt them.
Cool.
So they're all mine. And then we also adopted my nephew. He was in a bad situation. So we adopted my nephew. So now we have this nice gap between, we have 18, 16, 12, 4.
You got a lot of help.
We have a lot of help, but I'm like, I thought we were almost done.
Yeah.
Nope, it's starting over. Yeah. Okay, so this can be really intense for people. Probably the worst dysphoria I ever felt was actually after I started transitioning. There's something about having a beard and breasts that makes you feel like you should join the circus. Okay? And it's actually really funny because I just said something like this. We had a tag meeting, the exec meeting, which is, I'm the only trans man and then there's 3 trans women and that's it, that's our whole board. And I said, yeah, when I was the bearded lady and I wanted to run off and join the circus, I never felt more unhappy with my appearance at that point. And then I look around at them and they're all like, yeah, we know. And I was like, oh, that's true. Like as they're growing breasts from doing hormone, they still have facial hair, right? And I was like, oh, I didn't realize that was like a cross section that we both go through. So yeah, that was the worst. And then I was like, I wasn't really focused. Like it was not part of my plan to have breast removal surgery until kind of that point happened. And then I was like, I've never had so much anxiety, so much depression, so much fear of being like pegged. And I was like, these have to go, like instantly, they have to get out of here. And that is expensive and it's considered elective, so it's hard, yeah.
So taking testosterone doesn't make your breasts naturally get smaller? They still stay?
They stay. So testosterone is really strong in the characteristics that it brings out.
Okay.
But it doesn't get rid of any of the characteristics you already have. And then for the other direction, blocking testosterone is really hard. And so and you're on medication forever. So like when you make this decision to transition and to be on hormones, it's a decision for forever.
Okay.
Like if I stop taking testosterone, I wouldn't lose the facial hair because it's something that stays. And once my voice dropped, it wouldn't go back up. But I could start having periods again, which is like, I'd rather be dead. Which I think is how most women feel anyway. But if anybody could just like opt out, right? But so that would start again, which for a lot of, especially like young trans males who they feel male, but they're okay, right? When you're a kid, it's not as painful because all kids kind of look the same, right? They all have the nice little soft brown faces and they're all sort of flat chested and they all run around and it's okay to be a tomboy and it's okay to be a little bit of a girl, like, oh, that boy better butch up, right? But it's mostly okay. It's when puberty hits where this really starts to come into play. For my daughter, at 3 years old, she was telling the doctor she wanted to cut off her penis. So that was pretty terrifying. That was the first thing she said to her. We went to a pediatrician and the first thing she said to the pediatrician was, I'm here to get my penis taken off. Oh my God. And I'm like, hi, nice to meet you. What do you want to do about that? And she's like, okay, let's, where are you on the growth curve? Talk about awkward. These are good questions, yeah.
So now, if they do take the hormone pills in puberty, at that point it does stop the breast growth and.
Right. So what's going to be completely different about my transition means that I have to have surgeries, right? Or I don't have to, but in order for me to feel authentically male, I have to have at least one surgery. And often that's the case for the other direction too, right? And so what happens if you start, they won't let you do cross hormone therapy until you're at least 16. And you have to have like letters from your therapist, and you have to have been through that for a long period of time, and you have to be very consistent, which is really hard for a lot of the gender fluid kids, right? Like they're not going to be able to do things that a very consistent presentation can do. Like in some ways it sounds really kind of messed up, but for me, I'm very thankful that my daughter has been very insistent, consistent, persistent. She is a girl. Well, that makes my life so much easier because people understand, oh, this is the wrong box. Now I'm in the right box. They don't understand this like, I don't really want to be in any of these boxes. How do I avoid that, right? Like, that's so much more difficult for people to understand, including me. So she will be able to, right now she's on puberty blockers. So that blocks the testosterone, which means she will never go through male puberty.
Right.
Now there are lasting effects of that. So during male puberty is when you get sperm production. So there were a lot of questions about does she want to not take them and go through some puberty so that she can father children that will have her DNA. Now, you just heard the makeup of our family. She's like, I'll just adopt. And she's like, I don't care about that. They don't have to be connected to me with DNA, but some people care about that. And it's really hard. How do you ask a 12-year-old?
Yeah.
Are you gonna wanna have kids that have your DNA?
They can't answer until they're
It's so
15 or
hard.
16.
You know, it's so hard for them to know. I can tell you that, like for me, I knew if you had asked me like, oh, do you want to have your uterus removed? I would have been like, yes, right now, anytime, sign me up. But they would have said the same thing to me. Well, what if you want to have children later? I knew I was never going to want to physically carry children. Did I want children? Yes. Did I want to be the person carrying them? Hell no. And I knew that from the beginning, right? And so it's really hard because giving our children agency to make decisions about the future is really hard. And some kids are more mature at ages and others aren't. Some kids might say, I definitely don't care about that. And then when they're 22, they're like, God, I wish I had done that, right? And you're like, well, hindsight's 20/20. Like, what do you want me to do? That's why they won't do surgery. Bottom surgery, you have to be at least 17. And the only reason they're starting to do it at 17 instead of 18 is because typically the healing is better if you can still be at home. Because what happened a lot is a lot of 18-year-old kids, they get out of their parents' house, they have the surgery, they go to college in their new amazing body that they're all excited about, and then they have problems. And they're in a place they don't know, they don't have support networks, they don't have doctors set up who know them, they don't have anything. So they started doing them where they'll sign off on doing it when you're 17. But that's why they don't do surgery. And even then, who you were at 17 or 18 is not who you are at 30, right? And so you're making decisions that you cannot reverse. And so that's where a lot of, especially trans kids stuff, gets really sticky, right? It gets really difficult because you're making decisions for people's future that you can't really know what they're gonna want. It's really hard.
So the last time you presented this on gender dysphoria, I think you said something where gender dysphoria is caused by society pressures on people who are transitioning, and that's what creates the dysphoria in that, right?
Well, yes and no. There is some internal dysphoria.
Okay.
Just because, like, if you all were the same person you are right now, but you woke up tomorrow with the opposite gender genitalia, you just woke up and you look down in the shower and you're like, whoa, where did that come from? It doesn't change who you mentally are, right? You're still the same person, you have all the same experiences you've had, but now there's this other thing that doesn't feel like it belongs there. And you're constantly afraid someone's gonna tell. Someone's gonna know. Somehow they're gonna see it, or they're going to pick up on some subtle thing that you don't know, or that you aren't portraying correctly, and they're gonna find you out. The later part, right, of people finding out is the part that you're talking about. It's an external thing, right, where we're worried because of external forces and non-acceptance that it's gonna put us in a bad situation. It doesn't help that 1 out of 12 transgender people get murdered.
Right.
That does not make me feel any safer, right? So that's ridiculous. But there is a lot of external fear, right? But mostly I don't know if I'd say the dysphoria is mostly internal, I think. It's your feeling that you don't match and that your body is wrong. And that is a really hard thing to reconcile within yourself. We had a hard time with my daughter didn't want to wash her body because she didn't want to touch it. The 4-year-old's like, you have a penis, and she's like, no, I don't, I have a vagina. And I'm like, well, no, that's not accurate. And it's difficult to have those conversations, right? Because she's like, no, I'm a girl, and girls have vaginas. And I'm like, that's not really how it works anymore. That's what people told you for forever, and people still tell people that, right? That's how you know the difference. That's how a doctor marks a sex characteristic, but that's not what defines a male or a female. So it gets really sticky, and lots of people get upset about the idea of having that conversation in a kindergarten room, right?
Kind of an ideal situation. There's no boxes, no societal pressures. Do you think you would go through the risk of a surgery to adjust the way your body looked? Or
I kind of feel like that's an unanswerable question. Only because I can fantasize about a world where our bodies don't matter, right? But our bodies matter in so many other ways besides gender. I mean, how many people have self-harm because they're not skinny enough? Or they think they're not skinny enough, but they actually are like a stick, right? I mean, all of these other issues that if we didn't judge each other, the whole world would be different. But we do. We judge each other, because we judge each other, we judge ourselves. We often judge ourselves way harsher than the world would judge us.
I like that answer, how you brought in self-image and anorexia, other types of bodily image things. Yeah. And for me, it starts where you started at the fashion. It's marketing, but also the fashion industry has perpetuated a lot of ambiguity in that.
Right. And that's changing too, right? Like we're seeing plus size models. Right. They're normal size, first of all. It shouldn't even be plus size. Like they're normal body. Like what? It should be like anorexic modeling and then regular modeling. I don't know. It's not. It's like the top. Or I don't know why I said top, probably because that's society speaking, but you're talking about models, and the example that the media wants for models is maybe 1% of the population actually looks like that. And those poor women are starving themselves and doing drugs to look like that in the first place. I mean, not all of them obviously, but it's a very difficult thing to stay in that body image that the world has decided somehow
it's a shared struggle
important.
amongst straight women, too.
Exactly, and that's the thing is, one of the things that we like to share as an awareness when we're not kind of preaching to the choir is that gender roles are damaging to everyone. They're not just damaging to trans people, right? Like any straight boy who's bad at sports can tell you that he gets treated like crap because he's not man enough. Why? Not everybody has to fit into a mold, right? And when we push people to fit into a mold and we treat them badly because they don't, everyone suffers, right? And we've learned in the last, maybe 10 years, maybe less than that a lot of bullies, they're the ones who have problems, right? That's why they bully other kids. Right. So what are we really seeing here? We're seeing that judging each other and forcing people into stereotypes of whatever kind is detrimental to everyone.
And there's a need for strong self-identity and confidence in whoever you are.
Right.
Maybe I suck at sports as a man, but I have an excellent skill in finance. That's going to be respected.
Right.
And so
up to the parents for sure.
It is. And so if you're failing at one thing, you have to figure out what you're good at.
Right, I think one of the
combat
problems commonly with parenting is when someone's not good at something, or push them in that to try to make them better, especially in school, struggling in math, make you work harder, but you're like a boss in science, you know what I mean? Like, I have, you know what I mean? It's not my own idea, but like, I think we should really push what kids do best and like,
Right.
encourage
Focus on
that.
their
You know? Yeah,
strengths and
exactly.
build them
Yeah.
up instead of tearing them down.
100%.
Exactly.
I had a question, sorry.
Yeah, you're fine.
You had said earlier that top surgery was considered elective, so the
Medically.
insurance isn't paying for it.
Right.
Clearly, do you foresee that changing anytime in the future?
I do in
Sure.
Nevada. So not every state is lucky enough.
Okay.
Like I know I'm standing in California right now and I don't know what the California Medicaid looks like. But in Nevada, because of TAG, we've actually worked with the insurance commissioners to require that the state Medicaid covers not only top surgery, which works for male to female or female to male, but also for bottom surgery starting in January of 2019.
Wow.
Bottom surgery will be covered.
Congrats.
So if someone moves there from another state, like I have a friend who's right now like just started taking testosterone, and I know that's not covered where she lives.
Yeah.
Like if someone just moves to Nevada and then gets their state.
Yeah, that's exactly how it works.
Yeah.
Wow.
The trick, the thing that kind of
Yeah.
sucks is you know, Medicaid has
Like,
a very
super
low
upset about
like,
it.
money
Sure.
level,
Yeah.
right? Like, in order to qualify for Medicaid, you have to basically be like living on the street,
Yeah. Well,
and
the case
that's
as
the
well,
hard
so-
part, right?
Mm.
Which is great that it's available to people who are, because sometimes they're the people who are in the most needy place, right? Because if you're living on the street, you're in so much more risk and like every other way
Yeah.
possible, right? But what's hard is the people who are make just enough money to not qualify for Medicaid, and they have to pay for insurance, right? And so they're stuck in this area where, oh, I have to pay for this insurance, but it doesn't cover anything I need. Medicaid also in Nevada does cover testosterone. It covers estradiol, which is the estrogen for women, for men transitioning to women. It covers hormone replacement therapy. And, you know, not to get political, but it is getting more difficult to make progress in the current administration because the support isn't there from the top saying like, hey, trans people are people and we should give them the same, you know, if you're gonna do a surgery for a woman who is, you know, born a woman who needs to have something removed or have something added, if you do it for them, why wouldn't you do it for now somebody who looks like a male but still needs it? Like the idea of going to an OBGYN looking like this as a patient is terrifying. So, you know, then I put my own medical needs at risk as well, right, by avoiding that. And that's very typical of trans men, and they don't like to go to an OBGYN. Nobody likes to go to an OBGYN, first of all, right? Again, we're back to that. Nobody wants to have a pap smear ever. But when you have a beard and no breasts, it's even more awkward to be the person who has to stand up and get their name called, right? Like, and there are a few people, and they're in the guide, who will either like let you come in the side door, or they'll just call like the last name instead of your first name. And I told my wife, I said, if I have to go, you're coming with me because I'm just gonna pretend I'm there with you. But not everybody has that, right? Like, take a friend, pretend they're the person who's going, whatever you have to do to feel safe and comfortable, right? Okay, so another thing about gender dysphoria is that it is not the same as gender nonconformity, right? They're not stuck together. They often intersect, right? Not all people who are transgender or are gender nonconforming have gender dysphoria. Luckily we're not all horrible feeling. It's coming up. Okay. So like we talked about before, being transgender is not a disorder, and this is I think the part of the slide you're talking about. When it was gender identity disorder, it was really stigmatizing. Like, oh, you have that mental disorder, right? There's something wrong with you. That's what disorder means. What causes a lot of this strife is that living in a culture that doesn't really understand, support, or outright rejects transgender people or their existence even, which is interesting to me, can lead to other mental health issues, right? That's not surprising. I mean, is anybody surprised by that? I kind of am of the feeling, even before like transitioning and any of that, that like just all humans need therapy anyway. Right? Being human means that you already have some kind of disorder. Like, just in order to continue living, you need some help, right? Something has happened somewhere along the line that was not good. That's just part of being human. You know, and everybody has different levels of ability to handle that depending on where they are in their life and the other things that they've been through. Any questions about that? Okay, so some other words that are offensive to transgender people: she male, he she, shim, it, or thing. Some people self-identify as tranny. I would not want someone to call me that. What's great is when people say, well, you're not a real whatever, right? Woman or man. When did you decide to be a man, right? Like, you don't decide to be transgender. When did you first express your true identity? Would be a better way of asking the same thing.
What about, like, when did you realize it?
Right, that's a good question too. Not when did you choose, right? When did you make this decision? I made a decision to transition, right? That's fine. But when did I decide to be a man or a woman? That's just who I always was, right? These are great because I've actually been asked a lot of this. You look so real, I never would have known. Trans men get this all the time, right? And this is funny because it used to be, I don't know if it's still the same way, but it used to be a lot of people would be like, oh, well, there's not very many trans men, right? Like, there's like so many trans women, but there's like no trans men. No, you just don't, you would never know. That's the beauty of testosterone. As soon as I grow a beard, you just assume, right? It's like the easiest way to pass ever. There's still a lot of us, and we hide because we can. And that is its own struggle. It's much easier to hide, right? It would be so much easier for me to just like fade off and be like, no, I'm just this guy over here that lives and does his life. But then that doesn't help anybody else, right? And so that's always the trick there. Have you had or do you want the surgery, right? Unless you're willing to talk about your own genital surgery or genital like status, probably don't ask this question, right? If they're your best friend, they're gonna be already telling you more than you probably wanna know. You shouldn't have to ask. What is your real name? That one's always fun. Also in Nevada, we've done a lot of stuff with legal and names and gender changes. We've made it so that so my daughter, the legal name change part is ridiculously expensive because to change your name outside of a marriage change, it's like about $350 in Washoe County to file because you have to go through the court and they have to stamp it just like you would have to do for any other reason. We just got it changed so that there's a waiver. There used to be a waiver for domestic violence. If you were changing your name to protect yourself from domestic violence, there was a waiver so you didn't have to pay the fee. We added in there because a lot of times transgender people don't, you have to publish when you're going to change your name, which is supposed to be for creditors, which is super outdated and ridiculous because nobody ever reads the newspaper anyway. So stupid. But I think it might single-handedly be keeping the newspapers going because you have to publish for like 3 weeks.
You're gonna change your name.
Every day that this is your current name and that you're changing your name to this, and so it totally outs you. If your grandparents are reading the news in the newspaper or something, because like I never read the newspaper. I don't get the newspaper. I don't even read the one online. I'm like, whatever. What does Facebook say is happening today? Which is probably horrible, but true. Yeah, and so that's the point that we made was we said, if you already allow, this is what tag does. We take something that's already there and we're like, see how this is the same. Just walk with us this one little tiny step further. Done.
That's good. That's good.
That's why we've made so much progress because we're like, you already have this thing in place to protect people, right? Like nobody wants somebody to change their name for protection purposes and end up getting, followed and tracked. Now the abuser knows your new name. That doesn't help anyone. So you already have this process in place. Couldn't we just use the same process that's already there for trans people so that they're not outing themselves and making themselves a target, right? And they're like, oh my God, that makes sense. Yeah, we could do that. We'll just add that in. Done, right?
You think it for them.
Exactly. You take it, and that's the thing. Like, what we've really found, we've been doing this for like 6 years or something now, is that when you make things make sense to people, like you're logically like, okay, walk with me. This is what we're saying. Yeah, okay, we're getting good. Yeah, we get that. Okay, what about right here? How does this feel? And they're like, yeah, I mean, I guess I could get there. Okay, what about right here? Like, how do you feel about right here? And they're like, huh, yeah, I see where you're going with that, right? And some people get there faster, and other people are like, I don't know about right there. Maybe right here, I could go like halfway. I could meet you here. And we're like, okay, that's fine. We'll just leave you there for a year, and then we'll come back and check on you. Right? And we want any kind of progress is progress. You can't solve everything in a day. And sometimes you spend a lot more time just trying to block bad legislation, right? That makes everybody have to display their genitals to use the restroom, which is ridiculous. So,
It's boundaries.
yeah, right? Like, do you want to share your? I don't know. That makes no sense. But so where I was going with that was that I was going somewhere with that.
How you got it on the box to change the names?
Yes. Okay. So what we did was we took. There's a correction process on a birth certificate. Again, in Nevada, I'm sorry, where which doesn't work for me because I was born in Oregon. In order to change your gender marker, in some states they don't actually have a process. Like, there is no process to change your sex marker on a birth certificate in many states, which is weird, right? Because what if you're intersex? You're stuck with that for forever, right? In a lot of states, like Oregon, you have to have full gender reassignment surgery. And you have to prove that you have it. You have to have letters and documentation. Some states require pictures. I'm just gonna say that again. Some states require pictures of your genitals having been changed in order to change, right? What? First of all, wouldn't you love to be the clerk that gets that package? Open it up. Whoa, what am I looking at? Right? Why? I don't know. So Oregon, you have to have a full gender reassignment. So I'd have to have bottom surgery in order to change my gender marker on my birth certificate to male. That's just not feasible for me, and it doesn't. I want to actually be able to still pee, so we're not going to do that. But in Nevada, they had a process for correcting a birth certificate that was incorrect. And it did not include, like, you could change the name that was incorrect. If the time or the date of birth was incorrect, you had to have supplemental information to prove that, but you could change those things. So we said, well, technically, this is a correction. They got it wrong. They just didn't know they got it wrong, right? So how do we correct the birth certificate, right? And so that took a little while for people to get used to. And then they're like, yeah, I mean, we're just correcting it, and that's just an administrative process. So we could just do an administrative process. We don't have to do like a law or like something that people have to vote on. We can just administratively change this because it's a piece of paper, right? We can just correct the piece of paper. And here's our process for correcting it. And crazy enough, we got it. It was they still have to go through like little committees, and they have to be like voted on or whatever in the committee. And we got a unanimous vote of self-attestation. So for a kid, you have to get 2. And it has to be, at least one of them has to be a parent, I think. But, so as a parent, I wrote one for my daughter, and then it doesn't have to be a doctor, it doesn't have to be a mental health provider, it can be the other parent, whatever. So my wife and I both wrote one, and we took it down there, and we paid $35, and now she's female on her birth certificate. So she will never have that issue. When she gets her first driver's license, it will already say female. There will never be that, problem for her, which is amazing. And that shows a lot of like progression, right? If you live in Nevada. If you don't live in Nevada, you're screwed because we're the only one that's doing that.
Sounds like you guys are doing a great
Yeah.
job. Are you like spreading the word to other states, other groups?
Well, yes, to other advocate groups we are.
Right.
Well, we're really good at like staying under the radar. We don't want to make a fuss because what happens when you make a fuss,
Right.
as soon as you like get out the trumpet, right? You're like, look at what great things we're doing.
Yeah.
Somebody on the other side of the aisle is like, wait, you did what?
Yeah.
How did you get away with that? We didn't say that was okay, right? And then you have
Secretive.
this like
Yeah.
wave of like backlash.
Yeah.
So we're like, we're just gonna
just wanna
sneak under
slide
here, and
through, yeah.
we're gonna have a conversation about how this makes sense, right? And it doesn't cost anything, and it's not a big deal, and it doesn't hurt anyone who's not transgender.
Yeah.
It doesn't affect them at all. So we're just gonna go, yeah, we're just gonna keep doing that, right? And then we just tell everybody who knows people who are transgender, hey, this is their policy. This is how you do this, and that way we all just fly under the radar.
What is happening like internationally? This expansive, what I consider to be very much of a humanistic view. I mean, we're really talking about we're all human beings. We're all members of the human race.
Mhm.
There's no race, color, creed, and for that matter, I mean, someday they won't even ask your gender on a birth certificate. Like, what
Yeah.
fucking difference does it make? I
Right.
mean, really,
Well,
at the end of the day, but what's
yeah.
happening globally with it?
Well, nothing is happening on the national level, and that is directly because of who's in office.
Right.
because you can't go up against that kind of opposition head to head and get anywhere. It's never going to go down. A lot is happening at the state level, because not just in Nevada, but in other states, because the states are like, you know what? Like, we have these people, these are our constituents, like, whatever you're doing that you want to do nationwide doesn't work for our people. And people who are more on a state level are more, I don't know, like, maybe I just have a hard time with the idea that, like, somebody at a presidential level, whether it's Trump or Obama or whoever, right? Somebody at a presidential level, they don't live the same kind of life that I live, right? Like, they're not going to Walmart. They don't live in the same world that I live in. And I think a lot of people more at the state level, they do interact more in my spheres, if that makes sense, right? And in most of our spheres. They're more in tune and in touch to what's happening with people in general, not just people who fit with their demographic that they themselves have, right? You're not just talking about the good old boy network sort of group, right? You're talking about people, right?
I feel county level is where it started.
Even better, even better. I mean,
it
it goes down, right? And the closer you get, the smaller you go, the closer you get to real people, right? Like, that's just the way I feel. And so there's a lot being done on state levels. A lot of what we're doing in Nevada, we're sending to other people who are like, hey, we heard you have this. How did you get that? How did you do that? Can you send us the policy, right? And then we can say, hey, Nevada does this. Why can't we do this, right? Nevada, the redneck state of the world. Like, why can they get it, but we can't get it, right? And so, and all of the states that are a little bit more progressive in human rights sort of stuff and civil rights stuff, share. We share a lot of stuff. We took the LA school board policy for LA County, and we changed some things, but we basically took the same thing and presented it to the Washoe County School Board, and they took it. And because we didn't make a big deal out of it, they still had to do the public thing, but they didn't like say, hey, everybody, come tell us how you feel about this. They were like, hey, anybody want to talk to that? Right? And then they were down here. They still did what they had to do, but they didn't make it a big deal. And it just passed. LA's been doing it for 10 years. They've never had one problem. So we use that same information to say, like, look, you guys are looking for an answer. In Washoe County and in most places, it's like this. If there's no policy like set by the district, the principals have to decide on their own. Can you imagine being a principal and having to decide where a trans kid is supposed to go to the bathroom? And having no support, right? People in administration want like something behind them to be like, well, this told me to do this. This is not my own decision.
Or
So-
a trans kid have like a Christian principle.
Right. Well, and so that's what you see. You see these various ways of being handled. And as a school district, that opens you up for a huge lawsuit, right? When you're treating the same situations very differently, depending on what school you go to, that's a lawsuit. And what helped, sadly, in Washington County is that they had gotten sued and lost for a case where it was for, I think it was a gay boy who got just mercilessly bullied, and he changed schools and it just kept happening, and the teachers kept telling him, well, maybe you should just act less gay. Yeah, it was really bad. And so he finally graduated, and then he sued the school district and he won. And so we just said, remember how you had to spend a bunch of money on that because you didn't have a policy and you guys weren't sticking to the policy? This is like the next one that's going to happen. So you should pay attention because we're trying to help you before you get there. And they were like, oh, well. and that happens a lot. You go to the legal department and you're like, hey, you want to get sued? And they're like, what do you mean? We wouldn't get sued for that. And you're like, here's all the information. And they're like, oh, we would totally get sued for this. We should do this. Right? And that's how you make progress sometimes. That's just the way it works in America, right?
Yep.
Okay. So we kind of went over those. Challenges. I'm sure you've picked up on most of these already. Depression, prejudice, discrimination. Discrimination in housing is ridiculous. I mean, it can be really bad. Also in employment can be horrible. Especially if you don't have all your documents like in line. If you haven't been able to change your name, but you're already presenting in one way or the other, right? So you have a really male name and they think they're gonna interview a guy, and then you show up and you look like a girl who sort of also looks like a guy, and they're like, I don't know what's happening, but I don't want anything to do with that. And there's no way to prove, right? Like, okay, maybe it's illegal, but there's no way to prove it. How are you gonna prove that that's why?
Yeah.
Difficulty obtaining health care, just like any other LGB whatever, losing your family or your significant other, losing your job when you want to transition, and then all of the ways that people handle those things, right? Substance abuse, self-mutilation, suicide. It's a 46% rate of suicide ideation in trans people. So 46% of trans people have seriously considered killing themselves. We did a little study with UNR, they helped us do it. 19% of trans people have been refused healthcare, flat out refused. So you don't feel good, you know there's something wrong with you, you go to the doctor, right, where you're supposed to be getting help, and they refuse to see you.
What's the rationale that they try to back that up?
Isn't that illegal?
It is illegal, but again,
It happens.
how do you
So
prove it?
Are you talking about like going into the ER and they're saying no, or are you talking about your primary health care provider?
All of them. All of the above. And a lot of what happens with the refusal is it's sort of a passive refusal, like, oh, I don't really know anything about that, so I think you should see someone else.
Yeah.
No,
A referral.
it's not rocket science.
Yeah.
You could actually, like, I don't know, get some of those CEUs you need on this, read a article,
Yeah.
there's lots of stuff out there. And that's just the way that they get out of having to deal with it, right? Or having to treat you. 28% face discriminatory treatment in the doctor's office.
And to me, that kind of makes sense because if it's not taught while you're getting your MD,
Well, there's a lot of things that are not taught in medical school. They're not taught how to bill either, but they figure that out. Just saying, that is not part of medical school. Billing is not part of medical school, but you can bet that they will figure it out because they want to get paid.
Do you know any of the history of how the surgeries were researched and developed?
So it's still the most common surgery when it comes to trans, like bottom surgery, I'm assuming is what you're talking about. Because double mastectomy is something that's been around for a long time. For other reasons, obviously, like breast cancer or whatever. But most of those surgeries started in Thailand. In Thailand, they've been doing creating neo-vaginas for, I don't know, like 20 years, 30 years. Really what happens is you take a plastic surgeon who realizes that this is an untapped market, so to speak, right? And has already done maybe some reconstructions for other reasons, right? And they just start. Like if you're really desperate and you know that this is something that is really experimental initially, right? You go somewhere where somebody is willing to try it with you, and you deal with the results, right? And there are varying degrees of results. And what's weird is that there are probably, I think there's 3 or 4, there might be a few more now, bottom surgeons in the US who have done like apprenticeships with each other, kind of, so that they have some sort of training before because there's no school for, this is how you do a sex change kind of operation. There's no school for that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is there a school for how to do an abortion?
I don't know. I know that, I don't know, that's a really good question.
I think if
They're
you're
not-
OBGYN, I think you would learn that in your
Yeah.
specialty training afterwards.
Well, and
In
there's
your
there are
residency.
situations
There are
where they
medical-
know that,
Right, where it's
the
medically
baby-
necessary
yes,
for
right,
other reasons
yes,
than
exactly.
that you don't want to have a baby. Right. Yeah,
So most of
it's
these
getting better, but
doctors that you're
it's,
talking about are trained by themselves and then have been just training other people, kind of like grassroots kind of
Right.
stuff. Wow.
right, and as you can imagine, surgery has come a long way, but it's still really scary. I mean,
Yeah, there's
it's scary to have any surgery. Bad things
Right.
happen in surgeries that are routine.
Exactly.
So, it was really important to get the experimental terminology off of it, because a lot of insurances will be like, oh, we don't cover experimental surgery. So all of that is experimental and we won't do any of it.
And they don't, are they like becoming like an expert in nerves or anything? Like, or is it just like, trying to make it look right, you know? I mean, are they?
Well,
Right, like,
and
I
I
think
think it'd be like
functionality is the
like a
main goal.
more, like even more harder.
Well, I mean,
yeah, initially I think the focus is functionality,
Yeah.
and then from there, you know, it can only
Middle
get better.
development, yeah.
I mean,
Yeah, it's
they have
just-
some crazy stuff that they can do.
Yeah,
Like,
it's just really more a function of intention.
Right.
Because the GU surgery, all of the surgery, virtually you can do anything anymore.
Right.
You really can. So it's a function of just people accepting this and then focusing on realizing it's just another surgery.
Right.
It's just another part of taking care of a human being. That's all it
Right.
really is.
right, and you know, until you start doing surgeries, as you start doing surgeries and you learn things about what not to do, right, and then they get better. I mean, that's the case with every part of medicine. As my friend likes to say, if they practice medicine, they're not expert at medicine, right? It's called a practice for a reason. You know, and as much as somehow we give doctors the impression that they know everything, or they have to tell us like they know everything, they really don't.
Well, I think it's
And, you
supposed to
know,
be a continual thing as well as a
Right.
doctor, you know, because it's a constantly evolving thing that we're like, it's always new, you know what I mean?
Right.
Like,
Well, and in medicine, wherever the funding goes, the attention goes.
Right.
And it's extremely difficult to get funding to do trans surgeries. I mean, it's just not, it's not something that people are like, oh, I want to leave my entire millions of dollars to that. Like, that's just not happening. You know, and surgeries are really expensive. So practicing them and teaching other people them is something that's expensive. It costs money, and you have to have a facility, and you have to have, you know, all these other things. What I have seen that has improved surgeries and moved them forward is, and it's sad that it's the case, but it is, a lot of veterans who have had bombs go off that have sort of taken away their body parts in the same area. There is funding for regenerative surgery, right? Restorative surgery. It's the same thing, right? You're studying the same area, how it works, why it stops working, you know, how to make it work again in new fancy ways, right? Whatever you need to do. And so that is gaining some traction. About 6 years ago, I want to say, I saw a video where some lab created tissue that could make its own, like it could pick, you could program it for what kind of cell it was supposed to be, and they made like a vagina.
They say they could already grow.
And I was just
Yeah.
like,
But
what?
did you
That is
graft the
amazing. And of
nerves?
course, for me, I was like, transgender women would be so excited, right? That wasn't what it was for, obviously, but I was like, you can still take that same,
Tissue.
right? It's the same purpose.
Sure.
Yeah.
So I think that as those things get further along and become less stigmatized and less, you know, fringe, for lack of a better term, it'll become, like you said, you know, this is just another surgery that people sometimes need.
It's probably gonna be tougher to get like even like the really good surgeries through insurance though, because most doctors for something like that, they know they can make more money doing it privately. So,
Right.
You know what I mean?
Well, and that's the thing. I mean, how much, the hard part is that a lot of these surgeons, they know they're not going to get paid by insurance. And they know that a lot of trans people don't have that kind of money, right? They could charge whatever they wanted.
Right.
It's
True.
you know, when you have a rare commodity or a rare skill, you can charge zillions of dollars for it. And the people who can afford it will still pay.
And then on levels depending on your skills, something like
Right.
with breast augmentations and everything else, you know, you get, you know, like, so, you know, it's like a $2,500 or $12,000.
Right. 50 years ago, there were not a lot of people doing breast augmentations.
Right, now. Yeah.
Now there's like one on every corner, right? So it just, it has to become something that's demanded enough to provide that vacuum
Right.
where people then want to learn how to do it because they can actually make
It's gonna
money
take a
doing it.
while, yeah.
Yeah, it takes time. So 90% said that the doctors completely lacked cultural competency to care for trans patients, and 50%, which I actually think is a really low number, said they had to teach their healthcare provider about them being transgender and what their needs were. Which, if you're going to the doctor, right, would you want to go to the doctor and have to explain diabetes to them? No, you're going there for them to be the expert. You know, it's really, you're there, you're trying to get answers. You're not there to teach them.
That's when you
not
leave
your
the doctor's
function.
office though, right? Anytime you have
Well,
to
but
like,
if you can't
do-
find any
yeah.
doctor who knows any better, at some point you got to pick one that's at least willing to learn and set them on a path, give them some links, and be like, go figure it out, right?
Now, the resources that you have in this guide, these are ones that are have proven to have cultural competency
Yes.
and things like that?
We don't
Okay.
put anyone in the guide that has not gotten a rave review from a trans person,
Okay.
at least one. Another story I want to tell you really quick. I'm like way over your time.
That's okay.
Okay. Is that
This is a 69-hour course, so we've got less
Okay. Another thing is you hear these stories of people who, there was a trans woman that I know who went to the doctor because she was sick. She was coughing, she was having trouble breathing, right? Sort of pneumonia-like symptoms, and so she was scared that she was like, needed to be in the hospital. And she found herself in stirrups with a parade of resident hospital interns looking at her genitalia because she
You
said that
see
she
her
was
as a-
transgender.
Yeah.
That it completely has nothing to do with why she's in the doctor. Right? And if that was anyone else, that would never happen. It would not be allowed. It would immediately send up red flags. Right? And so these are the kinds of things that there's so much trauma that comes for transgender people with doctors because they have bad experiences like that. And it's awkward enough to talk about your body parts when you accept those body parts and when you like feel like they're part of you. It's hard enough to have a conversation. I don't know how many times doctors get calls that say like, oh yeah, I just don't feel good. And then they come in and the doctor's like, oh, so you have a cough? And he's like, no, but look at this,
Yeah.
right? Like, I've got this weird thing that I didn't want to tell your receptionist about, right? I didn't want it in there. This is what he's coming in for.
Yeah.
That happens all the time, right? And those are people who feel in line with their body parts. It's still difficult for people to talk about their body parts. So when you then add on top of that, this dysphoria and this anxiety of having to then, people again, you go into a doctor's office, they're going to assume the same things any of us assume on the street. You go into a doctor's office and have to be like, well, you're going to be a little surprised when you get down there because that's not what you're expecting, right? Like, and how you have that conversation with the doctor and how they respond. So much anxiety. And if it doesn't go well, how many times did it not go well before it finally does go well? How many times does it take before you stop going to the doctor unless you have to, right? Unless you're dying. And so a lot of people, they just don't go because they can't make themselves deal with the situation. And so that negatively affects the health of trans people. Okay, some more research stuff. A lot of studies are on trans women only, because of the thing I said earlier, where trans men, we just like go stealth, like you just don't know we exist. And so no one would ever think to give me a survey about what it means to be a trans man. Right? If you're at the front desk and you're like, oh, Adam's apple wig, why don't you fill out this survey about being a trans woman? I'm not going to get the survey. Suicidal thoughts, 67%. No, it's even higher than it was the last time I heard it. 38% actually attempt suicide. That's ridiculous. Ridiculously high. That was the study that was done in 2014 with UNR and that we helped with. 62% have depression. And then I thought it was interesting that actually these are pretty low numbers if you think about the substance abuse numbers are really low, and I think that's because a lot of times really there's no how many people use alcohol in this study, which I wish we had asked because I think that's a much higher number. And then HIV prevalence, because people always think whenever you're part of the letter rainbow that you're going to have HIV. 16% white and Hispanic and 56% African American, which if you've ever heard statistics about HIV, you know it's always higher in African American populations. It's just sad but true. And the highest rate of murder of trans people is African American trans women are targeted more times than anyone else. Okay, so although social acceptance is growing, parents continue to sort of abandon their children when this happens. So you end up with a whole lot of young people who have no support. 18% of homeless people are transgender youth. That's a huge proportion. I already told you that 1 in 12 people, that's in America, is murdered. In America, not like in the whole world. If you're trans, you refuse to go to Brazil. Brazil has the highest murder rate in the world anyway, just overall. But trans people are often killed publicly, and it's no big deal. Brazil keeps saying they're going to do something about it, but they haven't done anything about any of the murders. So people are even, there have been horrible, I don't suggest that you go look at them, but there have been horrible videos where they videotape people killing trans people and post them. And those people are still never punished. Yeah. Transgender youth whose parents pressure them to conform to their anatomical gender report higher levels of depression. That shouldn't be a surprise, right? Illegal drug use, suicide attempts, and unsafe sex than peers who receive no pressure from their parents. Obviously, if you're in a supportive environment, you don't feel the need to escape your life in these ways that are negative to your future, right? So some basic principles for intervention: supporting development, clarifying identity, protecting and promoting health and well-being. The long-term approach is realistic expectations, because one of the things that sometimes is still difficult for me is that I'm never gonna be able to stand up and pee on my own. It's just not something that I'll ever be able to do. It sounds great. I've wanted to write my name in the snow since I was 3. Okay, because that's what all the boys were doing, and it seemed like I should be able to do that too. Didn't seem fair.
Can I ask you a question? I don't know if you've ever practiced. We've got a really dear friend of ours who's a doctorate in psychology, and for her thesis, she talked about roles of women in society and not being discriminated against. And it's really kind of cute because she's got a video of herself, her sister, and about 10 or 11 other women standing on the 267 bridge. Mm-hmm. I mean, I wish I could have a stream like that. One of the daughters was about 10 at the time. I just went, it was very impressive. I hadn't really good either, but I mean, seriously, they got a side.
Maybe we should connect.
Right.
Yeah, I mean,
there's a lot of what they call stand-up devices. I have to tell you that I've tried several, and more often than not, you end up very messy. Which, if you're just by the side of the road with your friends, maybe isn't a dangerous thing to do, but going into a men's restroom and having that not work out right is not a risk I'm willing to take. And even though I understand that culturally men all say that they don't, you don't look at each other, if they did, it would be obvious that wasn't, the correct born anatomy, right? And so that to me is just it's not worth it. And I worry about the weirdest things, pee sounds different when you're standing up than when you're sitting down, and when you have a focused stream versus this spray that often you get as a girl. And so I worry about they're gonna hear that I'm peeing like a girl, stupid things. And then, my male friends are dude, no one's paying attention. And I'm okay, I'm just gonna keep telling myself that, because I feel it's, over a loudspeaker and everyone knows, right? It's so funny. Or I remember the first few times that I used the men's restroom, I felt like I needed to make pooping sounds, because that's the only reason a guy uses the stall, right? Otherwise, you're expected to use the urinal. It's so much faster. Why wouldn't you? And I'm just it was so funny. And then I was this is ridiculous. What am I doing? No one cares. No one cares. I just keep telling myself, no one cares. So realistic expectations. You have to know that you're never going to have been born with the body that you wanted, right? And so you can have all the surgeries in the world, and you may still never feel like you had that experience. And another thing for people who are older, like me, who transitioned later in life, and a lot of trans women actually transition much later in life. They've already had a family, they've been married, they've had kids, they've raised them, and now they're finally it's time for me to do what I want, for me to be happy, right? I've pretended long enough, now I want to be happy for myself. And so they often transition in their 50s, which is, I'm sure, even more difficult. I can't imagine. But the other thing is that you'll never have the youth of the gender, right? So you'll never have I don't know what it was like in the boys' locker room. Not that I necessarily want to know, but right, I'm sure there's just as many traumatic stories for boys who were in the locker room and were supposed to be there. But all of those experiences are things that you can't change. And those experiences make you who you are, and they make you have a certain view of the world, right? And so in some ways, I'm really grateful for the way that I was brought up and the things that I learned, because I understand women in a way that most men don't, right? Because I've been one. And I wouldn't have been able to sleep over at my friends' houses and have, girl sleepovers. Boys don't really have sleepovers the same, like, they don't talk about anything except like video games, and like what you did for your sons is something that's very different than what most men do, and you know that because that's not what you got either.
Right.
And that's one of the hardest things for me transitioning to male is guys don't talk about stuff, right? And if I talk to other women about stuff, then there's like this weird, well, you're a guy and I can't be that close to you, because if I get that close to you, then your wife's gonna get upset or my husband's gonna get, or whatever, right? And so it's really isolating to be a man. And what I've learned, and I think is really interesting and I like to share, is that often the people who are the most stern about stereotypes are men, right? They really perpetuate this need for men to be manly. And not all of them, obviously, but a good majority. Usually when there's a problem with a trans kid, it's typically with a boy being a girl. It's much harder for the father to accept a son who is girly, whether it's the same thing with gay men, right? It's the same thing. It's much more difficult for them. And I think part of that is because society expects men to not have feelings, not show feelings, except anger. You can be angry, that's it. And think about what that means for society. Think about why we have so many angry young men.
Sure.
Because that's all they're allowed to be, right? And they are not taught how to have conversations about how they feel. And then often what happens too is that a lot of times women say they want to know how their man is feeling and they want him to be sensitive, but then when they are, often the women are really brutal to them and are like, oh, you're such a wimp. God, you're such a crybaby. Why do you cry all the time? Oh, you're so sensitive. Like, you talk about your feelings more than I talk about mine. And that just reinforces that men should not talk about their feelings, right? So it's really interesting to me because it's very isolating. Another thing is sexuality. So basically I got to go through female puberty during the normal time frame of that. And then I got to go through male puberty at 32, which I don't suggest going through puberty twice. It's not fun. But it is really interesting because testosterone does different things to your brain, and the way that you think about sex is completely different. And one of the things that I thought was really interesting was, I mentioned one time to one of my guy friends, I said, it's weird how sex is like it's not something that you just sort of have an idea like, oh, maybe it would be nice to have sex today. It's like, I have to have sex right now because I can't think about anything else. Nothing else. I have actively tried to think about 17 other things, and every time I'm just right back here thinking about sex. Every time, just bam. 2 seconds later, sex again. What the hell is happening? And I asked him, I was like, how do you control yourself, first of all, because it's like a compulsion. It's not like like for girls it's like, well maybe it'll be romantic and maybe it'll be nice, and he has really nice eyes and he listens, like it's very emotional side, right? And with the testosterone it's like, where is the nearest object that sort of work? It is so very different. It is so very different. And that means a lot. If you think about, you can think about that later in society, what that means, right? And how different that feeling is. And it makes a lot of sense when you think about it. You're like, oh, that explains a lot, right? Mm-hmm. And so I was asking some of my guy friends, I was like, what was that like for you? Didn't you feel like you were losing your mind? Did it make you feel crazy? And who did you talk to about that? Did your dad talk to you about that? And they're all like, no. No one talks to you about it. And I'm like, I'm sorry, what? Like nobody talks to you about that. And I'm like, I would feel like a complete freak. Because if you don't know other people go through the same thing, you assume you're the only one. So the fact that you're not interested in a person, right? You're just interested in something, anything, is terrifying. And if you don't ever get to have a conversation about how that's perfectly normal and it will pass, and this is how you distract yourself, right? You're just gonna think that there's something wrong with you. And how much shame and just crazy, right? And how do you learn that control on your own with no guidance?
I think that's the thing, like for me, like not being talked to about control like that. It took me literally till I met Jessica and her friends when I was 36. Was the first time I could say like I had friendships truly with girls that didn't have ulterior motives. 36.
Yeah.
All, you know, before that was like every time I was hanging out with girls or girlfriends is because I wanted to have sex with one of them.
Right.
You know.
Right, because it's not because it's not about the relationship.
Yeah.
You can have relationships and there's sex that is involved with relationships too, but there's this whole other mental compulsion of like, I need to have sex.
Right.
And it doesn't matter who it's
compulsiveness,
with.
right?
Yeah, and it's, I'm glad that my friend was willing to tell me like, no, you're not crazy. Because I was like, maybe it's because I was a girl and now I'm taking this and maybe I'm having a different reaction than guys have. I don't know. This can't be how every guy feels. And he was like, no, that's pretty much how we all feel. And I was like, holy like really? How is everyone not just standing around like I don't understand.
When you grew up as kids, it's taboo to talk about masturbating, and every boy
Right.
try to pretend like they didn't until you're like a teenager. It's always like, I don't masturbate, I don't
Right.
masturbate. And everybody's like, yeah, right, like 3 times yesterday.
Right. 3 times before I went to school.
Right, yeah.
Right. And there's so much shame about it. You have to hide it. You
Yeah.
have to pretend it doesn't happen. And how much does that reinforce that there's something wrong with you?
You nailed it, totally. That, our country would be a way better place if parents, school teachers, nurses, doctors, everybody just could talk about how it is.
And in other
And the
countries they do.
distinctions between
Not all,
girls
but in other countries they
and
do.
boys.
It's not a big deal.
Yeah, so
General
Like a 20
distinctions.
minute.
the social
It's critical.
democracy. the social democracies do. I mean,
Yeah.
they do in fact talk about this. Health education, sex education is very important. We have a very, very sick culture in this country, and you're seeing the manifestation of it on a level that I'm 70. I've not seen anything, and I mean, it's going like this because of the fact, there's so much light that's coming to the darkness right now, and it's just creating a tremendous amount of fear. So it's, I think it will change, but yeah. Good.
I look forward to the men's sort of emotional and sexual progression of like freedom and liberation from the same gender stereotypes, right? And that's something that I think in some ways trans people are helping to push forward because they get to see both sides, right? And that is an interesting gift, and it's really difficult to explain. Like I'm lucky because I'm good with words, so I can kind of find funny stories that really impart the way that works. But it's really interesting because things change so much in your brain. And that's not something my doctor ever told me about.
What?
No. When I started taking testosterone, I was completely ready for the facial hair. I was ready for the deepening of the voice. I was ready for all these things. But I had no idea that my mental state and the way that I respond to things and take in information was going to change. And that was really a huge shift. It was very powerful.
Did you feel like brain raped, or like, I don't know how to really describe it?
It felt
Or
like
someone
Feel
just,
more aggressive all of a sudden?
No, I was really worried about the aggressive part because I was actually, with female hormones, I was like, I would get really angry and it would like last forever because that's what happens when you're female. I have this great analogy of like, let me explain to you everything you need to know about male emotions and female emotions. Females live in an ocean, and the water is the emotion. Okay, so they're constantly treading water, so they're tired already. That's why they're always bitchy, okay? Because they're like, where's the boat, right? Guys have this nice little path that's like well cultivated, it's very clear, and we're just like, everything's fine. Rainbow, sunshine, whatever, right? Status quo, it's about here, okay? Women have an emotion, and it starts as a little ripple, and then it gets bigger, and pretty soon it's a freaking tsunami, and they're freaking out. And us guys are still over here, we're like, why are you flipping out? Nothing has changed. We have this, let's say, pick an emotion that's not anger.
Happy.
Sadness.
Let's not do a good emotion, because that doesn't really reflect it as well as it should.
Jealousy.
Jealousy is great. Okay, jealousy. So, women start to get jealous, and here's the tsunami of jealousness, right? And the guy's like, whatever, there's jealousy. It's like, you know, like a bush to here. The anger plant is a tree. We water it 15 times an hour, okay? Because that's the only emotion we're allowed to have. So we put all of our energy into that one. So it's huge, but all the other emotions are like little plants,
It would
okay?
be fire. Anger is fire.
Yes. So all of these little cultivated plants, they're little. You know, you've got grief, sadness, jealousy, and then there's the anger, like, altar to the gods. That's huge, okay? And so when women are like, ah, you guys like, what? Yeah, like there's the plant and it's there and we're walking. Why are you flipping out, right? Why are you making it sound like you're dying? Nothing is that big of a deal. So we're over here on land, right? And we can just keep walking. We're like, yeah, I see it, but I'm continuing, right? Nothing major has happened. That is the problem.
So you think it's all just hormonal?
It
Or
is.
brain chemistry?
I don't think it is. I know it is because I've lived it.
So
I was afraid that I would be more aggressive. Especially, I was really worried about how I would respond to my kids because they're usually the ones that make me pissed off, right? And so they do something and I get frustrated and they're not listening and then I freak out and I yell at them. And as a woman, I'm like angry with them forever. And they're in their room for like 2 hours because I'm trying to calm down. As a guy, I'm like, I might explode in the moment, but then it's over.
So that's what I think. I feel like my own personal experience again in life has been dealing with men my whole life. Confrontation, not just anger, anything, debate, anything, whatever. We get to a point where we like hammer it out, so to speak, sometimes even fist fighting
Right.
or whatever, and then we're boys afterwards.
Yeah,
but
then it's
whatever,
over.
we addressed it. So like
Right.
my experience with women, and I'm not trying to stereotype or box, has been a lot of passive aggressiveness that comes out because they weren't allowed to. It was wrong. It's wrong for women to get confrontational. It's wrong to argue, be loud. So it's like kind of that box that put them in. So
Right.
they learned a roundabout way to express that emotion
Right.
too. I feel, and that like manifested heavily, at least in my experience with women. Like I said, my ex was super passive aggressive. It was one of the hardest things for me to ever deal with. It was like worse than being able to go head up. Killed me, you know what I mean? It's like, and
Right.
so and I'm a very emotional human being too. You know, not just not female. You know, but I think it's part of the conditioning of our society too, is where like, I don't know if all women act like American women. I'm not saying all women are emotional, I just think it's the way the tactics that have been developed because of all the constraints and
Right.
conditioning placed upon us as
It's
men.
not appropriate. It's not considered appropriate.
It's easier
for a
for
woman,
men in a way to
which
deal
is
with
really
emotions,
interesting
because
if
we
you
don't
think
get in
about
trouble for it.
If women
you know?
experience emotion in this more powerful, sometimes
They're
all-consuming
crazy
way,
or,
right?
you know.
Where it's not by choice. It is a physical response for a woman to have these emotions, where it physically manifests for them. So they can't just like turn it off. Whereas for what my experience has been as a guy, and the other guys that I've talked to have the
Yeah.
same experience, they're like, yeah, I see,
Yeah.
like grief
Most
is a
men are
great
like
option. Women, again, it's a wave, and it may go away for a while, but then it comes back too. And every time it just hammers them, and they don't have any way to get their footing, right? Whereas guys always have their footing. And so it's that not understanding is there, because if you've never felt like you're underwater with an emotion, how can you ever understand someone who feels that way all the time? Right? And so you're always going to have that disconnect of trying to understand where the other person is coming from. And what ends up happening is women just think men don't have emotions. I had a really hard time because initially, so my wife and I have been together 10 years this year. And so obviously we were together before I transitioned. And she had to deal with all kinds of crap about that, but that was interesting. That's another story. So, but she, and she was concerned about how that would work too, like how, if I would be more aggressive and angry or not, and actually I'm much better, and our fights are better actually because I understand, I'm like, okay, you go explode, and I'm gonna sit there. So, what was I gonna say about that? There's so many fun stories.
This is so interesting. I'm like,
Yeah.
it makes so much sense.
I needed
Yeah.
to meet you about 30 years ago. Where were you when I needed you 50 years ago?
I don't know, but I totally lost my train of thought. I don't know where I was going with
When
that.
you were talking about the aggression, we were talking about.
I think passive aggressive is something that when people don't, if they think that we don't have emotions, well, that's what it was. Okay, so I felt like, again, with the waves, right? If you think about the, what is it, the amplitude of a wave is the height of a wave, right? So women's emotions have this big, right, where it comes in these waves and they're huge. So they know when they're angry, they know when they're sad. It's not like, oh, maybe I'm sad. No, like they know. For guys, it's not, it's like the wave is this tall. And so what my wife and I had a lot of problem with, I actually went through this whole period where I was like, I don't know if I'm in love with you. Because I don't feel the love. And so thankfully I didn't do anything crazy or stupid. I just sort of waited like, what is happening? But she got really insecure because she was like, I don't feel like you love me. I don't feel the way that you made me feel before. And I was like, well, I don't feel the way I felt before either. I don't know what's about that, but I'm not going to tell you that because then we won't have a relationship to discuss. And eventually what happened is those reference points of, okay, I feel this way, and then I feel this way, and then I feel this way. Finally, I started to find them. They were way down here. So yes, I love you a lot, but the wave is only this big because the whole of what I feel is only this big. And like anger, I'm like, ah, okay, let's move on. It's so brief. So the feeling is there, but it's not as intense as what it is for women, which is why men always feel like women are crazy, right? Oh, they're so emotional, everything's so dramatic, it's such a big deal. Well, because they live like this, and we live like this. When you're like this, there's not a whole lot of room to really get that upset.
Or excited.
You know, or excited, or
I can't
anything.
relate to it. I think I live like that too.
Well, and I'm saying in
You know?
in a stereotypical
Yeah.
way, right? There's this
Totally.
difference. I think everybody is there's always a spectrum, right?
Yeah.
So there's people
Right.
along there. There's women who have this. There's men who have this. That's just the way it is. But I feel that testosterone showed me how
Yeah,
much that really
logical side. It's
shows
like a
because you're talking about the
logic
same person. And
I
the
think
only
it
difference
definitely
is
has to
the
do with
one.
our wiring. I mean, like, you know, there's a lot of things women are wired with for children that men just are not. You know, you know, there's definitely.
Greta, did you have a question?
Oh yeah, I just wanted to say, you know, yeah, we have periods and we have to have kids and there's a
Thank
lot
you.
of downside to being a woman. It's not easy, but I do think that there is a great spiritual power that resides in the woman femininity, and you know, you could even continue to explore that in your world and not put yourself in the man box so much.
Right.
And also, like, we are able to find grounding when we practice it, and that's a spiritual practice again, is, you know, learning how to root down to the earth. And that was something I never physically felt until I had natural childbirth, you know, and that was like, I am on the earth, and I realized like how disconnected and flighty, you know, emotions out of control, all these other things, that was really transformed through childbirth, which is, you know, a gift from life or God or whoever else. And it's the other side of the negative stuff that tends to arise.
And I don't have a negative experience.
I did not take that from you.
Good. I'm like, I just want to make
Also,
sure I'm
like,
not saying like, oh, it's bad to be a
I
woman.
know.
That's not what I'm saying.
It connects
It wasn't
back
right
to
for
the
me,
feminine.
No,
but I think that women are
dance
amazing,
club.
and women don't get the credit that they deserve for all of the things that they do and have to put up with, and for dealing with men like me and other men. Like it's every human being has value and is amazing
Yeah.
in their own right, and it is difficult for people to feel that about themselves, even a lot of the time, right? I mean, that if it wasn't, none of you would need to volunteer for this, right? It's something that every single person struggles with it on some level at some point in their life, and that is like the great equalizer. That everybody needs help at some point for something that they don't have the ability in that moment to handle. Right? That's why you guys are doing what you're doing, and that's what's amazing about what you do is that you will see every person from every walk of life, from every different checkbox, right, and every different label that you can imagine, and some you probably don't know or we haven't covered, right? So it's something that affects everyone. The human condition affects everyone, and dealing with other humans is often the worst part about it. So you guys are the light in the middle of that.
Well, you could be the light too, because you're the
You are.
different. You're different.
Yeah.
And differences help define the sameness, even.
Right.
And so it's powerful.
It's hard being human.
Yeah.
You know, I mean,
It is.
we've been studying metaphysics for 40 or 50 years together and pretty much done everything. This is one of the most powerful conversations I've ever been engaged with. So I thank you deeply for that.
That's awesome. Yeah.
And also one of the most entertaining.
That's
I think that you
Yeah.
could do stand up in a heartbeat. And
know.
you would be famous.
This
The human
required
condition
class.
is hilarious, let's be honest. And when you can talk about it openly,
Yeah.
and that's the thing, like with TAG, all of us are like this. Because those of us we don't do the presentations if we can't get up here and talk about ourselves, because that's what makes it worthwhile.
So healthy.
You know, and it's the same thing if you don't know someone, if you haven't met someone and truly engaged with them on an authentic level, then it's nothing can change your mind, right? Nobody cares about the person they've never met, right? But if you've met someone and you've felt some kind of connection to them, even like, oh, that person was kind of cool. If that's all you get, you're still gonna be like, remember that person that I met that one time? Huh? Like, that's the whole point. Make the human connection. Make people see you as a human being and not some statistic or some, piece of information or some label that they've never heard of and don't understand and don't know where to put. Right? As soon as you make it a human issue, then they'll do the right thing more often than not. No matter which color they wear on election day.
It's very healthy. I mean, this type of transparent conversation is required in order for this country to heal. The movies we've been watching here, the one called Tough Guys 2, is very difficult to watch because it really is. It's toxic masculinity.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel great compassion for the geopolitical slant that we're experiencing right now because they're so shut down. Their humanity has been shut down. I can't imagine what it would be like to live in the headspace of somebody like our president and most of the cabal. I mean, that's horrific. But until this is brought to light, until you can have conversations like this,
Right.
this can be very difficult to heal. It's about honesty.
It is. And it is difficult to be up here with a room full of strangers and be vulnerable and talk about, things that happened in my life. And for me, it's worth it. I don't get conversations like this in my everyday life, right? These are not the conversations I have with people I work with even. That's why I love doing this, because I get a chance to share stuff that I know makes an impact and that I know may at least be the conversation at some dinner party that you're at, right? If nothing else, like, oh, we had this really weird conversation with this person who came in, right? Like, even if you hate me, you'll still have something to remember me by. Like, that's what I'm going for. And it can be difficult, but it's always worthwhile.
Dude, you're empowered every time you do it too. You love your vulnerability to be out there like that and line up with your truth. Yeah,
I'd strongly recommend you get a copy of this. I'm not kidding right now.
Mm-hmm.
This should be a TED Talk. Absolutely.
I would agree.
TED Talks are
Absolutely.
only 7
agree.
minutes.
Well,
Some of
It's
them
been
are-
like 2 hours.
Or edit it, edit it, but still, I mean.
Yeah, I agree.
It's seriously, it's that
You know,
powerful.
and I think that Andrea
Yeah.
can attest to the fact that the best part about this conversation is it's not the slides. It's not just me telling you things, right? It's not a presentation. It has to be an interactive experience. Because if it's not, it doesn't work. If I can't see any of you, and I just have lights on me, and I'm just talking to a room and hoping there are people there, this doesn't work. And that's the problem, because I wanted to do, one of my professors is Brett Simmons, who does the TEDx talk at UNR. And he tried to get me to do one once, and I didn't really have time at the time. But I really wanted to. But the problem is, I can't, what piece do I condense down? It's so difficult to, it's one thing to convey an idea, right, in 7 minutes. You can do that. They show that you can do that. It's really tough, not impossible, but it's tough to make a connection with multiple people in the audience in a way that's lasting and impactful in 7 minutes. And I think it's possible, but it's something that is going to take a lot of work to make. And so I want, when I do want to do one, and I think when I do, it's going to be really intense, and you want to talk about vulnerability, it's going to have to be like so raw.
Yeah, that's how you're going to make the connection.
It's going to have to be like
laying it out there,
ridiculously
your
raw, and
personal
that's something that you have to like work
experience.
yourself up for, right? And so that's going to be tough, but I think that it does have value. I think you're right.
We could probably just edit this.
Right? Just clip it down.
No, I love when Nick comes in. I love his presentation, the presentation that TAG puts on. It really, and based off of our class size, it helps people get an understanding of other people. And so that's what I like most about inviting them here. And then also trying to tie into, what happens if a transgender domestic violence survivor calls the helpline or comes in and needs to seek services. These are some basics that you need to know for them to know that it's okay, that it's safe for them, and that you're not going to, withhold services and things
Well,
like
and
that.
that's been difficult too, because I don't know what services you guys have on this side of the state, but I know we worked with a lot of domestic violence agencies, because most of the time they're just women's shelters, and those women do not always feel comfortable having a trans woman come in. They feel threatened, depending on what stage they're at in transitioning. They may still look very male, and these women have been traumatized, and you don't want to create space for one group of people that also causes problems for the other group of people, right? You have to find something that works for everyone. And it's difficult. It is a difficult situation, and a lot of trans women who are domestically abused don't think there's anywhere they can go. Or they think that they deserve it, right? Because there's something wrong with them, and they're not a real woman, and they don't deserve to have a real relationship, or they don't deserve to have a real man, or many of those things that we all have internal issues with, right? All of our own self-identity issues of worthiness. Specifically, a lot of the time, I think I kind of said this, but I want to say it again because I think it's important. When does a person decide to tell someone they're interested in or someone they're already dating what kind of anatomy they have? And how do you have that conversation? Right? Can you imagine trying to have that conversation? When would you have that conversation? Right? Like, you don't want to have it too soon, because then what if you really like this person, right? But you're afraid they're not going to like you back. And you think, if they just get to know me, then maybe it'll be okay, right? And so you go through this process of getting to know someone, thinking that then they'll fall in love with you and it won't matter, right? Which in some cases may be true, and in other cases is sadly the opposite of true, right? And that's how you end up in violent situations most of the time when it comes to trans people. It's that kind of situation. Because they just don't know, and then when they find out, or if you've already gone through all of these surgeries, right, and you're a real woman, right, maybe you don't feel like you should have to tell them that you weren't always, right? And then something happens, and somebody outs you, or somehow they find out. The level, I can see it from both sides, not the violence, obviously, but I can see the feelings and the anger and the betrayal feeling that, you know, I thought you were this person, and now I found out you're not this person. And the part that happens is, what does that say about me?
Exactly.
And that's the problem. It's not, yes, there is female violence towards trans men also, but it's not nearly as prevalent as male violence towards trans women, right? Which again goes to the same, all of the things that we've been discussing. That's not a surprising thing to hear. It's not good, but it's not surprising, right? And the idea that a man who identifies as heterosexual, and especially a man who strongly identifies, right, as heterosexual, can have serious issues with the idea that they're with someone who wasn't always a woman,
I
right?
think you just kind of maybe have like little conversations like, hey, how do you feel about gay people? Or they're not just gay people, but the.
Right.
Yeah.
So, you know.
Start off with baby steps,
Yeah.
right? I mean, it's a difficult conversation to have, and I do think that what happens is people don't have it soon enough.
It's a
Yeah.
sinking ship, kind of, you know. I can totally feel anxiety myself when we talk about this, because I can't even imagine the anxiety of meeting somebody, having that connection, right? Everybody knows what that first connection has been like, whether it's good or bad, but, you know, having a connection, trying to move forward, and then knowing that you have the secret, like, when is the best time? You will never know the answer, and it's just so, like, oh, it just
Yeah, it's really tough. And to be honest, I mean, if you already have gender dysphoria, you already kind of feel like a freak. I mean, that's my word that I'm using. It's not, I'm trying to make that anybody else's word, but there's that feeling of like, I already am different in a way that a lot of people are not okay with, right? And that I hide most of the time because you don't get to see my genitals when I walk down the street, hopefully. So how do you expect anyone to accept that? Right? We have our own, people have their own issues without being transgender about their body being accepted by somebody that they're attracted to, right? So then you add that to the mix and it's just like a whole new level of terror. And so it's difficult, and there are a lot of relationship concerns, issues, isolation, depression from relationship related concerns. Questions about domestic violence in particular? No?
I would just say I would love for you to come up and talk with some of the head people. We did have a transgender woman in our shelter last year, and there were some problems that arise with other guests living in there.
That's usually what happens. It's not
Right.
usually the staff. The staff
Right.
is great usually,
That
but it's
it-
other guests that are like, why do you have this man here?
Right, that a lot of staff had to face, well, how are we gonna take this on, head on? And I think they did a really appropriate job. They did it from an education
Right.
of understanding and helping this other person understand and their children understand of what's going on and things like that, which I think was awesome to do, rather than just say, hey, sorry, it's not working out for you, and
Right.
you know, you gotta go somewhere else because
You're making other people uncomfortable.
Right.
Yeah.
So I thought our staff did awesome at that. I mean, I still think that we can always do more work,
Yeah.
you know, and have better understanding as new staff come in. So that would be awesome. But, you know, it's very important to have these conversations.
Definitely. That's what we're here for.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're a gift.
Thank you.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Doing good work.
Yeah.
Nick is doing great work.
Excellent.
But acceptance, I mean, that's the other thing about the conversation, if you're, you know, there's some confusion, if you can sort of sense is how accepting is this human being that I'm relating with right now?
Mhm.
How loving and kind are they? Because that actually, you know, applies to everything.
Wouldn't
I
it be
mean,
nice if we all used those
everything,
filters
you know,
initially? with people?
right.
Right? Might save us all a lot of problems already later
Yeah,
on.
because you don't get that
Right?
generally when you're a
Yeah.
child unless you're raised in that environment. But as you get older and mature, you just start realizing that acceptance and tolerance
Right.
is, you know, is
Well, it's still
compassion.
difficult for many people. Like I have teenagers, so you know they're constantly pining after someone who has no interest in them, and that happens as adults too, right? We are attracted to someone and they are clearly not interested, And we will do whatever we have to do to get them to be interested, right? And that causes its own set of problems, whether you're transgender or not.
I have a question about like sexual assault in the trans community. Is there a big push for them to get into like the sex industry? And if so, and if you've seen that, do you guys work with Awaken?
We don't. Tag doesn't work with Awaken. So what's weird about Tag, I say weird, but I guess that's not maybe the best term, but we don't provide direct services to trans people, which sometimes we go back and forth on. Every year when we look at our mission and what we're doing, we're always like, should we start? And what we always come back to is we're the only people doing what we do. And there's only, there's the 4 of us on the board and we have a couple of volunteers and that's it. Mm-hmm. And we have almost no funding. So we're pretty much self-funded. So if anybody has extra money, feel free to go to our website, donate. But, so we do as much as we can with a very little amount of things. So partnerships and stuff like that, we don't really get involved with. Mm-hmm. What I can say is that there's this situation that gets created where, and it's hard for me because I'm not a trans woman, so it's hard for me to understand how it would work. But my understanding is that often with trans women, the only place they get validated as a woman sexually is in sex work. Because people, typically men, will pay to have sex knowing that it's a trans woman. And so they get validated in their version of being a woman, right? And they're being sexually desired for themselves, right? In a way. And so that may be the only way they get that validation. And so that's why it happens a lot. Yeah. The other thing is a lot of times, like I said, trans people have a really hard time finding work. Mm-hmm. And if you have no other opportunities to pay your bills, but that's something you can make money doing, and it somewhat validates you.
Yeah, I mean, my personal opinion is that's great if they feel empowered doing it.
Right, if it's their choice.
But my thing is, sometimes sex work leads into getting into sex trafficking, depending on situations. Right. And so I wonder if, even Awaken is, I don't know, have understanding. I know they're the sex trafficking in Reno, but if there's any understanding on that and how to provide services as well. Yeah,
I'm not fully versed in that. The other thing I would say is that typically you don't see a lot of trans men in prostitution. Mm-hmm. Usually sexual assault of trans men happens because men find out that they're not real men and try to make them straight. However you want to, they try to make them into being a woman. Oh, you just need a good, and then you'll be okay being a girl. So that's typically what happens as far as sexual assault for trans men, which is terrifying. Sexual assault is terrifying. No matter who you are or why it's happening, it doesn't really matter at the time why, right? But that is typically the situation that happens for that. And often, sadly, it's not complete strangers. It's often like acquaintances, right? And then they find out that you're trans, and then they attack you. So.
And then another question I had is, to be a volunteer at TAG, do you have to be transgender?
No. We have an all-trans board, just because we feel like that makes a greater impact statement. But we are an allies group, so you don't have to be transgender to be an ally. If it was only transgender people who could be allies, we would be a much smaller, we would make much smaller amount of impact, right?
Yes. Great.
Awesome. Anybody else?
All right. Yes, thanks for coming up here.
Yeah. Thanks for letting me talk.
Yeah, no problem. I have to talk. Okay, let's take a 5-minute bathroom water break. So I just wanted to kind of hone it back in with talking about the LGBTQ community and domestic violence. I know we just touched on the T today, and I was gonna touch a little bit more, but we're short on time. So on page 55 is where it's at in your book. It talks a little bit about the barriers that lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender people face when they're facing a system that is often oppressive or hostile towards anybody who is other than straight. So when you think about that, not only criminal justice system, but family court systems, when you have judges that are uneducated about different people in our culture and how their culture, learns, has violence in it, things like that, you can definitely get different results. But we're pushing towards education. So it'd be cool to read that. And then on the back side is the power and control wheel. Violence looks different in these sorts of relationships. They look very different, and so it's good to reference this wheel when somebody who is a part of this community is talking to you about their issues, because your own relationship bias that you've experienced and things like that may come into play, and you kind of have to check that at the door. So for the last 10 minutes, I figure we can go around, each person reads a piece of the pie. If you can read it. Realize you can't read it. But I'll start with you, and how about you start at one?
Which one, the using coercion and threats?
Sure.
All right, using coercion and threats. Making and or carrying out threats to do something to harm you. Threatening to leave or commit suicide. Driving recklessly to frighten you. Threatening to out you. Frightening others who are important to you, and stalking.
Right, so some of them we'll see that go over into say heterosexual relationships, but the biggest one that we've often seen is the threatening to out you is huge, is a threat that's used often in these kind of relationships. You may not be telling your family or friends, social media, things like that you've decided to keep private of what your what you identify as or what you like your sexual orientation is, and so the threat of outing you could really keep you in a very abusive relationship and not wanting to leave. Greta, can you use the using intimidation one?
Sure. Making you afraid by using looks, gestures, actions, and
smashing things.
Smashing things. Abusing pets, displaying weapons, using looks, actions, gestures to reinforce homophobic, biphobic, or transphobic control.
Okay. Tanya?
Using emotional abuse. Sorry, I went to the dentist.
It's okay.
Putting you down, making you feel bad about yourself, calling you names, playing mind games, making you feel guilty, humiliating you, questioning if you are real lesbian, real man, real woman, real femme, real blood, etc., reinforcing internalized homophobia, biphobia, or transphobia.
So how do you guys think that this is probably one of the main ones that is often in the box of checked off use? When you have a vulnerable population, and like Nick said, you could often see somebody outside of this population dating somebody in this and using these, or in the same culture and still using these as power over control because they understand that these are very hurtful things.
Yeah, it's weapons for sure.
They use them as weapons.
Any vulnerability, entering any relationship, that's like one of the biggest things that you're going to, if you're going to have a real relationship, is becoming vulnerable and believing that the other human being is going to be sensitive, compassionate, right? I mean,
totally, and not use the things that you have expressed that
yeah,
you're
that
vulnerable
you get right,
about
not
against
as you exactly. Are you going to close off and really, hopefully, if you're right-minded, just walk away. You know?
Yeah. All right, Becca. Or I mean, wait. Sorry, I just
Can I pass? Because I mean, it's just a little.
Yeah. So denying, I can read the rest. I'm sorry, guys. This copier didn't do it right. So denying, minimizing, and blaming. So making light of the abuse, saying it didn't happen, shifting responsibility for abusive behavior. A lot of times I see in family court when you're talking about the LGBTQ is they're accusing of mutual abuse because they're either two guys or two girls, and there's no way that there can be a power difference in that, so they'll be just accuse them of mutual abuse. saying women can't abuse women, men can't abuse men, saying it's just a fight, not an abuse. That's often mentioned.
You skipped using.
Using isolation.
Oh, did we?
Yeah.
We can.
Controlling.
No, it's okay.
You want us to read it?
Sure.
Somebody, you want to read it, Becca or Joe?
Yeah, sure. Controlling.
Sorry, Alex.
Using isolation.
Sorry.
Controlling what you do, who you see or talk to, limiting your outside activities, using jealousy to control you, making you account for your whereabouts, saying no one will believe you, especially not if you're lesbian, gay, bisexual, or trans, not letting you go anywhere alone.
Yep. Do you have a question?
No, I just wanted to share a quick experience with the other one we were saying. I'm a lesbian, and years ago, one of my first relationships, I was with another chick, and she was a corrections officer for Baltimore City. And totally, I don't even know what the argument was about, but totally freaked out, like locked the door, and the door's locked on the inside from there. Mm-hmm. So like she locked the door and took the key. I'm not getting out of the house, and there was no like signs of that something like that would happen from her beforehand, but it just did. And she flipped and like locked me in the house, held a golf club to my head. I had to like break the window to get out. And when I tried to report it, they were like, "Well, she's another chick, and she can't be like the police like totally, just like I'm like there's a freaking." I don't even know what I threw through the window, like huge something or other. I don't even remember, like, it's like, but I'm like, what do you mean? Mm-hmm. And then there was another aspect of, well, Baltimore City police are corrupt, and she's a corrections officer, there's no way it's gonna go through anyways, even if you can find a cop that can see eye to eye to you. They're gonna take, the judges and the police are gonna take the corrections officer's side no matter what. Uh-huh. So like, I've been in this situation where there's like, yeah, a girl can't, and I'm like, I was terrified.
Yeah.
Are you kidding me? She's trained how to kill like 300-pound men or take them down at her job. Like, yeah. So, oh, well, you guys are the same size, so like.
Yeah.
And I mean, I was younger. I was like probably like 23 when this happened. It was pretty shitty.
It's really, yeah. I mean, thanks for sharing that because it shows a story that's really unfortunate that happens to a lot of people, not only you, Becca, where, you know, you have law enforcement and the response is, she's a girl. Yeah. Or she's the same size as you. Somebody even smaller than you can cause harm to you that can cause death, you know, bodily harm or death. That doesn't mean that you should just chalk it off as it was two girls in a cat fight or whatever, you know. Yeah, I'm like, I threw something out the window. I've got like blood on my arms from jumping out the window. What do you mean this wasn't a terrifying experience? Right, like, there's so many different dynamics to it. And I feel like because a lot of these places, this is starting to come about where they need training and things like that. They even, I sit on this like Nevada legislation thing where we talk about issues in domestic violence and sexual violence fields, and they have law enforcement. Las Vegas PD has even tried to throw out the idea of having a LGBTQ police officer to just deal with that, and that doesn't solve the issue. Yeah. I mean, everybody needs to be trained in those kind of things. It's not just one person where you're like, oh, send them out, you know. It's like
call the expert.
It is so frustrating because that's what they think would solve it, and you're like, no, it's just you have to understand that it's not just male, female, guy's bigger than a female, so he did it, you know. I mean, that's not going to solve anything. So thank you for sharing. Yeah. Using children, making you feel guilty about the children, using children to relay messages, threatening to take the children, threatening to tell your ex-spouse or authorities that you're lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, so they will take the children. I saw this one case, I wasn't actually directed in it, but I saw like a review of it where the father, ex-partner, he found out that his wife was now dating a lesbian and then was presenting to the court that how they were they were doing homophobic acts, sexual acts around the children and things like that. I mean, those are serious concerns that people are bringing into family court to get people to get their children taken away from them, which is sad. But they're using the fear of the LGBTQ, you know, of what that might be in their power. They're using the vulnerability. So that was really sad too. And then using privilege, treating you like a servant, making all the big decisions, being the one to define each partner's roles and duties in the relationship, using privilege or ability to pass to discredit you. So like Nick said, most trans men can pass because the testosterone brings out the hair, deepens the voice, things like that, but it's harder for trans women because it's hard to get rid of the testosterone once it's already there. They don't pass as often. Pass meaning can get through with society without people knowing that they're different. Put you in danger, cut off your access to resources, or use the system against you. So, and then using economic abuse, preventing you from getting or keeping a job. So that's outing somebody. Making you ask for money, interfering with work or education, using your credit cards without permission, not working and requiring you to provide support, keeping your name off joint assets. So it's a little different in these relationships and a little, I would say it's something that people need to know because it looks different, and just because it's not what's happening in your relationships, or if you've had abusive relationships and it's not matching up, it still is abuse if it falls on this thing, okay? Any questions? All right, who do we have for Thursday?
Thursday, that's on.
All right, so thank you guys for coming today. On Thursday, we will have one of our volunteers, Nicole Ross, presenting Awaken's performance. They could not make it. And then that will be sex trafficking, what we'll be talking about for the first half an hour. And then the last half an hour, or hour and a half, the last hour and a half is going to be our immigration advocate, Iana. And usually she invites a couple of her past clients that have success stories now out of there. She's going to be talking about VAWA and immigration and the work that we do at Top of State Clients with immigration.